all the committee members are here, so let's call the meeting of the Environmental Rules Review Committee to order. I think everybody has the agenda in front of them. And Kendra here has, for the committee members, if you don't have the rules in front of you, Kendra's got extra copies here. So welcome everybody to the October 31st meeting. Just a couple of introductory notes here. There's public comment on the agenda. We've got cards if you want to make a public comment. You can see David Fiedler there has cards, so wanted to note that. I think the meeting is also, I believe, being live streamed and will be available on the department's YouTube channel after the fact in case somebody wants to go back and watch it for entertainment. So I also wanted to introduce, we've got two new members on the committee who were appointed to fill vacancies since our last meeting. Daniel Frakes from St. Clair Shores as the Director of Global Regulatory Development for General Motors. So he's been appointed to the committee to represent a statewide manufacturing organization. So welcome, Daniel.
Thanks,
Happy
Robert.
to have you aboard.
Really look forward to working and being part of the committee.
Excellent. Thank you. And then Shayna Berry, who is from Portage, is the Director of Government Affairs and Strategic Partnerships for Schupan & Sons, a metals and plastics recycler and manufacturer. And so she has been appointed to represent the solid waste management industry. So Shayna, welcome. Happy to have you aboard. So I think we've got a full house here today, but the next item on the agenda is the roll call. So Kendra, you want to handle that?
Yep. Janet Barlow.
Here.
Shayna Berry.
Here.
Tyler Ernst.
Here.
Mark Fowler.
Here.
Daniel Frakes.
Here.
Dave Manis.
Here.
Patty Murad.
Here.
Robert Niedereth.
Here.
Jeremy Orr.
Here.
Eric Pessel.
Here.
Helen Taylor.
Here.
Grant Trigger.
Here.
Everyone's present.
All right, thank you. Next item on the agenda is the approval of the agenda, which I think everybody's had in advance. So if someone wants to make a motion to approve the agenda. Support. Dave Manis with support. All in favor, say aye.
Question?
Oh, sure.
Comment?
Yeah.
In our packet with the agenda came agenda, copy of the rules, and an RIS document. I don't see the RIS document on the agenda. Are we not reviewing or was that not supposed to be part of the agenda today?
Well, it'll be, so that's a document that I'd say it's part of the rules. So if we've got questions on the regulatory impact statement, we can certainly ask those as part of this. Yeah,
okay.
It's all part of the package. Yeah,
Great.
That's a good question. Because that's a very important document as well. But I'd say it's a review of the rule package, really, including the RIS. So I've got a motion, I guess, on the table which has been seconded to approve the agenda. All in favor of approving the agenda, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Okay. The agenda is approved. Next item on the agenda is the approval of the committee minutes from our June 27th, 2019 meeting.
Motion to approve.
Second. Okay. Yeah.
I'd like to suggest a minor modification because the minutes, I think, could be misread.
Okay.
If you go to the second page of the minutes, there's approval of the ERC minutes, there's the approval of the MPART minutes, there's a recommendation, and then there's a motion moved to accept the health-based value recommendations. The motion passed with all ayes. I'd suggest that it should read, Dan Eckinger moved that MPART accepted the health-based value recommendations, because it could be implied in the sequence of the minutes that was an embracement and an acceptance by the ERC also.
Sure. That's a good point.
So I'd like to make that amendment to the rules.
Okay.
Did you follow me, Ken?
I did.
All right. I guess. So I guess let's. Can I get a motion to approve the minutes as amended by?
So moved.
Okay. Second. Okay. All in favor of approving the June 27 minutes as amended?
Aye.
All those opposed? Okay. All right. So now we'll move on to the agenda here, which will be a presentation on the draft rules of supplying water to the public, commonly known as the PFAS rules, which will be presented by staff from Eagle. I think it's maybe helpful just to kind of, before we jump into that, just kind of level set where we're at in this process as a committee. So remember, we're not, our approval is not a final decision on the rules. This is going through the process as set forth in the statute. The rules were posted, delivered to the committee on October 11th, which under the statute, we then have 35 days to take some action on the rules. And there's a couple different options. We can kind of say we're done with them, send them off to the regular rulemaking process. We can accept them, move them forward to a public hearing. We have the option of saying they don't meet the criteria that are set forth in the statute for the rules, or we can say, as a committee, we need some more time to review them. And just in terms of timing, 35 days would have started on October 11th. So our next scheduled meeting after this one is November 21st. The 35 days would have expired before that November 21st meeting. So as you look down the agenda, we do have a vote on the agenda, and that's because we sort of don't have to, but we should do something today, whether that's give ourselves more time, because that 35 days will expire before our next scheduled meeting. So we should do something today, which is why that vote is on the agenda. So I just wanted to just sort of make sure everybody's on the same page in that respect and where we are in the timeline and under the statute. So I don't know if there are any questions on that. Otherwise, I think we can turn it over to our presenters.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm George Christian. I'm the Assistant Division Director for Drinking Water and Environmental Health. And so this afternoon, we're going to give you this short presentation that just kind of goes over the whole process that we've gone through here recently, both with the stakeholders, the development of rules, and where we are today. So the things that we'll talk about here is we'll do a little bit of a process overview. We'll talk a little bit about the various stakeholder groups. We'll outline the rule. We'll talk a little bit about the regulatory impact statement. And then certainly we can entertain any questions and discuss the path forward. So in July of this year, we began the first round of stakeholder listening sessions, and what we did was there were 5 different groups that we created for stakeholders. Mainly what we wanted to do initially, at least in the first round, was to get like-minded individuals together so that everyone could feel free to share their opinions, and we wouldn't have to worry about folks that might have opposing opinions on a particular topic. We wanted to basically just encourage a free dialogue. So we broke that up, and I'll share with you what those groups were here in just a minute. Based on that, we then took the input that we had from that initial set of meetings, and we created our preliminary draft rules. And that then precipitated the second round of stakeholder meetings that we had. And in the second round, we basically consolidated everybody, because one of the things that we got back from the stakeholder groups was, while they appreciated the fact that they had an environment where they felt like they could speak freely, they were also interested in hearing what differing opinions might be. So we consolidated everybody in the second round of meetings. And based on those meetings, we did some revisions to the rules as we initially had them. And then on October 1, we presented the final draft rules to the governor's office. So this just kind of outlines what we just talked about. We had the listening sessions, we drafted the rules, we got the input from the stakeholders, and then we provided the rules for consideration. Here are the stakeholder groups that we had. So the first group consisted of the industrial group, and you can see the various associations that were in that particular group. The next stakeholder group was the health group, and then we had the environmental group, and over there are all the folks that participated in that. Then we certainly had the municipalities group. These were essentially the folks that were going to be directly impacted by these rules and the associations that represent those particular entities. And then the fifth group was a citizens group, and we utilized the MPART Citizens Advisory Council list, we operated that as a webinar rather than a face-to-face meeting, but it was an interactive webinar. We had lines that were open, and so people could provide feedback during the presentation, and it was mainly for the purposes of providing information, but we also did solicit comments from them, and we asked them if they felt strongly about anything that they provide feedback. So now we'll talk a little bit about the draft rules, and so the things that we'll cover here are the applicability, the sampling requirements, the reporting requirements, the proposed MCLs, the compliance calculation, public notification, treatment technologies, and laboratory certification. Those will be the things we talk about. So the impacted supplies that are going to be directly affected by this rule are the community and the non-transient, non-community water supplies. But within the rule, Eagle is going to reserve the right to require sampling of other regulated supplies as well. But this is the target of what we're looking at. With respect to sampling requirements, the general requirements is we're going to have the supplies take a sample at each entry point to the distribution system. And so different systems may have one point or they may have multiple points depending on how the system is set up. And so they'll need to take one sample at each one of those points. And then Eagle also reserves the right to require confirmation sampling. There have been at times situations where there were anomalous results, and so if we see that, we can certainly ask the system to do confirmatory analysis. And we can also require systems to conduct more frequent sampling. So for instance, if they have variations in their system or we see some sort of seasonal variability, we may ask them to do more frequent sampling. Now, the way that we're going to roll this out, we had to take into consideration a number of factors. So to the extent to which we could mimic the way in which the SOCs, the synthetic organic compounds, are done, we tried to do that as much as we could, with the recognition that this particular test is quite sophisticated. There are not a large number of laboratories that have this analytical capability. The instrument itself costs approximately $500,000. So clearly only the medium and larger labs typically are going to be able to have this. So we wanted to take into consideration the fact that we wanted the rules to not be hampered by that. We believe that there are sufficient labs that are now coming online to be able to provide this, but we wanted to do this in a stepwise process. So In the first quarter, when these rules take effect, the supplies that are over 50% of the MCL and those supplies that had not participated in the initial survey that the state conducted would be required. Then within the first 6 months of the rule, the other supplies, those that did not have a detection or would then be would be sampling. With respect to ongoing sampling, the supplies that would be subject to quarterly sampling would be those supplies that had a detection above the reporting limit. So if they had any amount, they would then go to quarterly testing. And just to give you a feel for what kind of impact that had, when we did the statewide survey, approximately 90% of the supplies had non-detects all the way across the board for all the compounds. With one caveat, the method that was utilized in that initial survey was EPA method 537, which utilized 14 compounds. The method that's going to be utilized moving forward is 537.1, which includes 18 compounds, one of which is the Gen X compound. So we fully acknowledge that we do not in the state have data on the Gen X compound, but when we did a little bit of a search, we don't believe that that's going to have a significant impact. So we anticipate that roughly 90% of the supplies will continue to have non-detects. And then those supplies that had non-detects would then be conducting this testing on an annual basis. In the event that a system that was on annual testing in the future had a detect, that would move them into quarterly testing, and that's consistent with the way that the SOCs are conducted currently. With respect to reporting, the supplies, once again, this is pretty much taken right out of the SOC requirements. They'll be required to report within the first 10 days of the month following the month where the results are received, or within 10 days of the end of a monitoring period, whichever is sooner. And these you're probably familiar with. These are the proposed MCLs. We went with the values that the Science Advisory Work Group had developed. And when we made that decision, we did that decision based on several factors. We wanted to take a look at, is the analytical capability out there? Are the laboratories going to be able to see these compounds at these levels? Is the analytical capacity out there? Are the treatment technologies out there available to do this? And so with respect to all of those variables, we felt that those could be accommodated. So we went with the Science Advisory Work Group recommendations, and that's why those numbers are what they are. With respect to the compliance calculation, it's going to be done on a running average, annual average at each sampling point. And as we talked about earlier, there may be systems that have multiple points of entry. So if one sampling point is out of compliance, then the supply as a whole is out of compliance. As I indicated, supplies that have a value that exceeds the reporting limit go to quarterly, and any sample result that causes a running average to exceed the MCL at any point, that will create a situation where we will declare an MCL at that point in time. So for example, if you take a look at PFNA, the MCL, the proposed MCL is 6 parts per trillion. If a supply, for example, were to have 40 in their first sample, that would create a situation where it was mathematically impossible for them to not have an MCL, even if the other 3 were non-detect. So at that point, the MCL would be called.
Do we have a chance to ask questions or not? Do you want us to wait until the end?
If we Well-
best to wait till the end if, yeah, if you just, I think that's probably best.
Yeah, if we could wait till the end, we might be answering some of your questions as we go along. If confirmatory sampling is required, the confirmation results will be averaged with the first result, and that average will be used for the compliance determination. And we also reserve the right to exclude results that have an obvious sampling error from the calculation. With respect to public notification, that's required if the supply is in non-compliance. So if a water supply is out of compliance with an MCL, that would trigger a Tier 2 public notification, which is required within 30 days. A Tier 2 notice requires mandatory language about the source of each contaminant. A failure to monitor would be a Tier 3 public notification, and so community water supply, their violations must also be referenced in their annual water quality reports, also known as their consumer confidence reports. With respect to treatment technology, for the purposes of the regulatory impact statement, we utilized GAC. We recognize that there are a number of treatment technologies that are available, and so by stating that GAC is the best available technology, we're not making a statement that dictates that supplies utilize GAC. That was simply what we utilized in our RIS calculation. So a supply is free to take a look at whatever technology may be out there, and it's up to them to basically utilize whatever technology they see fit, as long as they can substantiate that they're going to meet the MCL criteria. With respect to laboratory certification, the method that's going to be specified, as I indicated earlier, is going to be EPA method 537.1. This method was chosen for a number of reasons, one of which is the EPA methods tend to be very prescriptive in nature. And so from a regulatory standpoint, that's helpful so that we can compare apples to apples. When you have a highly prescriptive method, that means that all of the laboratories are doing it the same way. There is no proprietary technology, and so it's very easy to take a look at that method and see how a laboratory has done it. With respect to the reporting limit, for all 7 of the compounds, we have set the reporting limit at 2 parts per trillion. This was done through conversations with various laboratories, asking the question, what is the lowest number that laboratories are confident that they can see within the confines of the method? And in our conversations with the various laboratories, including the Eagle Laboratory, we determined that 2 was appropriate. The laboratories will also be required to undergo third-party proficiency testing. A PT sample is simply a sample that has a known quantity of the various constituents, but the laboratory doesn't know that. They analyze it, they provide their results to the PT provider, and then they're graded on that. And then in the rules, we also have provisions for suspension and revocation if the laboratory is failing to meet the criteria that's specified in the certification process. With respect to the regulatory impact statement, we anticipate the cost for sampling and analysis to be $6.4 million. This is based on the number of systems that are going to be affected, the estimated number of entry points, and who we anticipate is going to be on quarterly testing. And this is all based on the initial statewide survey that we conducted. So we feel that that number is pretty accurate. Based on the approximately 24 systems that we believe are going to have an issue as a result of utilizing MCLs as proposed. The initial treatment installation is anticipated to cost approximately $7.4 million, and the ongoing annual cost would be $326,000. So that's kind of how we based our RIS. So with that, I'll open it up for questions.
Question regarding the method detection level of 2 parts per trillion.
Mm-hmm.
Is that covers all the?
All seven.
All seven.
So each and every one of those are going to be
Be able to
two
get down to
individual. Yeah.
And you stated that you looked at the method, the capability of
Mhm.
labs to detect at that level, but also the treatment technology and its efficacy, if you want
Yes.
to call it that. And granulated activated carbon was determined. Did you look into the granulated activated carbon and what happens for disposal, or is that part of the study that you made as to what the life cycle of what happened to the PFAS? Are they going to be disposed in hazardous waste?
I'm not sure. I honestly don't know. I hadn't put together that part of the RIS. You know, that is a really good question, though, because part of the challenge that we have is we want to create a situation where we're breaking the PFAS cycle. And so each one of the treatment technologies, whether it be ion exchange or GAC, we have that issue. You know, we can have a concentrated waste stream. The plus side of the GAC is it's a non-aqueous concentrated stream. So, you know, other technologies, you don't have that, but, you know, there's plus and minuses with each one of those technologies.
Just to follow, is that a question about the same thing? I think the RIS says, this is probably what you're getting at, that would be another benefit of the rules if that was incinerated, right? Because then you break the chain. But
Right.
my question was related, like, that's more expensive, right? So are people actually going to do that?
Yeah, but the question is what the decomposition compounds would be. I don't know if this has been established. If you thermally treat it and break it down into
I see.
what is it, the intermediate compounds and how stable they are, and whether you're really destroying it or you're creating another issue. That's
Right.
To interject another dynamic there, some experience has demonstrated that regenerated carbon is not as effective as virgin carbon. So there are a lot of people who have given up trying to use regenerated carbon. So you don't get the quote destructive benefit unless you're regenerating the carbon. So if you're not going to reuse regenerated carbon, that doesn't happen. So the question really is, does it tip the balance in any way here to imply that there's a benefit of destruction of the PFAS by the assumptions in the analysis? If that doesn't tip the balance, then it doesn't matter. Because there's a limited number of facilities that are treating here. But I do think there is reason to question whether which decision would be made that this is beneficial because of destruction that may not happen. Because it probably won't in most cases.
Yeah, Eric.
A few questions. Regarding the MCLs, are they going to be reported out from the laboratory in whole numbers, decimal, to the 10th, to the 100th? Is it going to be like a 6.15 or 6.0?
It would be individual parts per trillion, so 2 parts, 3 parts, 4 parts.
Whole numbers?
Yes.
Okay, so is 6 parts per trillion for PFAS okay, or is that
That's the
is that
maximum
achieved?
amount that's allowed.
That's allowed. So 6 is okay, 7 is bad.
Correct.
And there won't be a 6.5
That is
because they're
correct.
going to do it in whole numbers.
Yeah.
So your running average question for that one, instead of using 40, let's use 7.
Mhm.
So now they're at quarterly. The next result is 6. They're automatically an MCL because their average is 6.5.
No, it would be, what we were talking about was if a particular result were to make it so that the running average, so
Right.
all 4 points,
So you have to have 4 points before you have a running average?
Yeah, but if you have a number that is so high that it's irrelevant what
That you
the other.
can't do it, then
that-
it's an automatic
yeah,
MCL.
yeah.
So if it's not so high, then you have to wait for the whole year of samples before you can do a running average.
That is correct.
It won't be the second quarter sample or the third quarter sample, unless one of those came in so high that it made it
That is
impossible.
correct.
Okay. Can I keep going?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Going back to your stakeholders, for the way I understand it, you had separate groups like you showed,
Mhm.
and you had a July listening session with those individual groups,
Correct.
correct? And then you said you brought them together for September 2 dates, 18th and 19th? Okay. How much participation did you get in that? Was it high number of people participate in that meeting?
Where's Dave? Dave, do we have attendance numbers on that? It was fairly well attended.
Fairly well attended?
Yeah,
Do you know when the invites went out for that September 18th and 19th?
I do not. Do you know, Suzanne?
Off the top of my head, no, but I was here.
I think it was a week.
Okay.
And I know that part of our oversight is to make sure that the process is followed. And I don't know if a week's time is appropriate for a group that size to make sure we have good attendance. But if we had good attendance, then maybe it's a moot point.
We had those 2 listening sessions. The first one, we had like 22 or 23 people there, and then the second one was not as well attended, but I think there were like 8 or 9.
For the September 18th and 19th meetings?
So one thing that I will share with you, because we recognize your concern, one of the things that we did do is in the first round, we tried to paint the picture as far as what the future was going to hold. And so we were going to tell them there was going to be an accelerated schedule.
A quick turnaround.
Yeah.
It was impossible not to be able to do it. Right? I mean, it was, because you, at the first meeting, you hadn't written the rule yet.
Right.
Then you drafted something, so now you have something for people to review, and you had to get it done before October 1st.
Correct.
Because that's what we said the timeline was. And I think it went out about a week ahead of time, and I don't know if we had good attendance, if we had 22 or 30 people show up out of all those groups, if we're comfortable.
And if it was just for one group or one subset of those groups and not,
There was a
evenly
good
distributed.
mix, I can tell you that. There was a pretty good mix.
And then my second thing, I guess you said that people did have some thoughts or suggestions, and you did make some changes based
Correct.
on that feedback.
Yeah.
Okay.
There were a couple of actual errors that we had, internal inconsistencies with what we had written, and people had pointed that out, and so those were the kinds of things that we definitely took care of.
Cool. Okay. And then I have a question on the RIS. Is now the time, or?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. In the RIS, I think it's number 10. You have that. Fiscal impact on the agency. You got that?
Yeah, I'm there.
Okay. Is the agency the only regulatory entity that will be overseeing these rules? Is Eagle?
Eagle, and for the non-transient, non-community water supplies, that is done through the local health departments under oversight of Eagle. So local health departments will be involved in the non-transient, non-community.
So in the answer to number 10, does that accurately reflect the potential costs to locals? Being that I'm a local, that's why I'm asking.
Yeah. Well, so give me just a second, I want to read it so that I can give you a good answer.
Do you have thoughts on what that cost will be for your department, for example?
I know it's going up. I don't have an idea because there's another question I had that
Well-
would lead to that.
I'll answer it this way. One of the conversations that we have on a very consistent basis with the locals is the lack of funding. And this is programmatic wide, it's not specific to PFAS. And so I recognize that we are not funding the locals as much as we would like to. And, you know, that's unfortunately the nature of the beast, and that's the most honest answer I can give you.
Okay. Thank you for that. I mean, I think we know that, but I just, whenever there's an RIS, it would be nice if we could remember that when there is another entity. I know it's really asking for the agency, and that's, but we do receive that funding from you, so it'd be nice to tie that together. And then the only other question I have is in the rule itself, because it pertains to this funding question, because I don't think we really have, where we sit, we don't really have an impact on the rule, correct? We don't have a say in what the rules say.
Potentially.
Other than this RIS.
If I understand so if you've got issues with the rule.
Like if I had an issue with an MCL, that's not our bailiwick. This isn't what this group is about.
Well, indirectly, it is. I mean, if you've got
I just have one that relates to the RIS and the cost.
Yeah, go ahead and ask it. I guess our role is to review the rules against those criteria if we feel there's a reason that, one of the MCLs doesn't meet one of those criteria. But go ahead.
One of the criteria is the draft proposed rules are necessary and suitable to achieve that purpose. I think what you're saying is, could be, if you can point to that, if there's an
Gotcha.
issue
Okay.
that is concerning that it doesn't achieve its purpose, then yes.
All right. And the one I would like to point to then is Rule 717D, as in dog, paragraph number 2. And in our presentation, it was noted as impacted supplies other. I think that's what you were talking about when you said there would be other potentially impacted supplies besides the community and the non-community, non-transients.
So that's reserving the right to allow other
Yeah.
regulated entities to
Right.
sample.
Right.
Okay, so that particular rule, it says for transient non-community, which a transient non-community is like a gas station, C-store that serves coffee and pizza and all types of stuff. Where it's a transient, or I'm sorry.
It's different people
Yeah,
every day.
it's different people every day. It's not a factory or it's not a school where it's the same people every day. And then a type 3 public water supply is actually defined as everything that's not a 1 or a 2. Everything that's not a community or a non-community is a type 3. So you might have a duplex, a home that has 2 homes with a common driveway, and usually the garage separates the 2 houses, where they have 1 well that serves the 2 homes. That would be a type 3. Or you might have a C-store that doesn't do the coffee and public water. So it would be a type 3 well. So it's a public well, but it's really not what this originally was for. So the question is that if Eagle could require samples for those type 3, that would have a different impact in the RIS for locals for sure, and for those supplies that right now don't have any sampling requirements beyond when they drill the well from the very first time they drill it. So for type 3 water supplies, there's no sampling requirements currently in the law, and this would could change it. Am I reading that
Yeah,
correctly?
that's a
Okay.
correct statement. So let me put that into context.
Can I give you one more piece of
Sure.
it, because
Sure.
that way I don't have to come back? And then the state of Michigan has taken those type 3 public water supplies, and they have put them together with our private water supplies and made that a mandated program that local public health implements at the local level. So type 3 and private are lumped together through a mandated program. And I don't know, this question might have been asked, but I don't know how this rule that could affect type 3 if that somehow could eventually affect private water supply. Because of how it's, because of how Michigan does it.
Yeah.
Not because of private's in the law, but it's how Michigan does the program. It's a P3 program, it's one
I
program.
would say as written, it's constrained to the transient, non-community, and type
Right.
threes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But I can see your concern, there's
Yeah.
an indirect pathway to that, but as written, no, it wouldn't affect.
But to just try and allay your concern a little bit, again, this is consistent with other language that we've had with respect to SOCs. One of the primary reasons for having it is if we have a situation where there's an impacted area and we want to be able to conduct a little bit more thorough of a survey, I think that's kind of the typical situation that we're looking at. So, you know, we're not looking to create work for the locals. You guys have enough to do. But we just want to be able to respond appropriately if there's something of concern and there's a potential health risk there.
I think that's it for me.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, Katie?
Yeah, so thank you, George, I appreciate the presentation, that was helpful. One question that I had as I was listening to how you were explaining things, for the MCL levels that were set at the low levels that they are set at, was it based on the availability of the equipment today to test those levels, and that was the main criteria, or were there other data and research?
Well,
come up with that,
yeah,
those
the
levels?
main criteria. So first, we wanted to take a look at, these are the numbers that were proposed by the Science Advisory Work Group. So could we simply accept those numbers as is? So then the criteria that we looked at the analytical capability. Could the instrument see low enough to be able to produce meaningful results? Was there adequate analytical capacity out there? And
Could you explain that a little more?
so, as I indicated, these instruments are very expensive. They're about $500,000 a pop. So it's going to have to be a well-established laboratory to be able to do that. So we worked with the laboratory certification program because we wanted to basically front-load the system. So the approach that we're taking, because we're anticipating that if all goes well, we're looking at something in the area of April, May, June of next year where these rules would go into effect. And so in the interim, we're proactively soliciting laboratories to develop this capacity. And so what we're hoping to achieve is the lab certification program. While you can't certify for something that isn't regulated, what you can do is go out and do an audit of the facility and put all of the steps in place so that when these rules do go into effect, you now have a whole initial class of laboratories that on the day that that rule went into effect, you could just issue the certification for those laboratories. And so based on the information that we have from the private laboratory sector, we believe that we do have that analytical capacity now.
Now, did the Science Advisory Group, did they provide any data or calculations, whether it was human exposure levels or whatever, that led them to come up with those numbers that were set?
That was our June meeting here.
Okay.
Yeah. We all saw that, they presented.
Is it available?
It is,
Should
yeah.
be.
Yeah, there's a presentation, I think, on the ERRC website. I actually have it right here, I think, if you want it. Yeah. I had a couple of questions. Just to clarify on the cost numbers that you cited. So initially I read the 7.4 million. That was what you saw as the cumulative cost for those 22 sources to install like a GAC treatment,
Yeah,
is that right?
basically to retrofit the facility so that they could. So what we did do, New Jersey had conducted a pretty thorough study of this. And so what we did was we took New Jersey's formulas and basically we just plugged our data into that. And so that's how we derived at those numbers. So yeah, that's basically the upfront costs of retrofitting the facilities that we believe are going to be impacted. And so that's the number that we came up with for the initial cost.
Okay, but didn't the RIS say, maybe I misread it, but Plainfield alone, which was one of the municipalities that had to.
They had
They were
received
like $15 million by themselves, or?
No, they received a grant for,
There's Plainfield.
It's on the bottom of page 6.
yeah.
So I was confused whether the scope, what
Yeah,
we're talking about per municipality is millions of dollars, or if that's.
Well, they had already,
It's on the bottom of page
no, I
6.
see it. I'm trying to recall what's
We don't
going
have to
on
write it.
there.
Sure, I'll drive it.
I would have to get back to you to provide you a proper answer on that. We can certainly do that. I believe, and we need to verify this, I believe that that wasn't included in it because we had provided them with a $750,000 grant for GAC, and I'm not familiar with what this 15 million is, so we'll have to take a look at that.
Because, yeah, obviously if it's, millions of dollars per municipality, that's a whole different story than 7.4
Yeah.
across the state. So.
Rob, a related question. Of the 22 that tested out already, have some of those started to expend these monies already, I guess is kind of a related question. Are there ones that in the first round of testing have started to already install GAC? And are those
Well, their
included
system,
or
yeah.
excluded in your numbers, I guess?
Well, you have a system like Ann Arbor,
Mhm.
which has been proactive, and they've installed GAC on their own. So, yeah, that.
Did you subtract that out before you?
That was not included in the total. And so I suspect that something similar is going on here with this 15 million. One thing that I would like to note, though, as we move forward, because we know there's going to be something after PFAS. And so the department has created what's called the Emerging Contaminants Unit because we want to be a little more proactive in trying to anticipate what the next thing might be, whether that be pharmaceuticals or endocrine disruptors or harmful algal blooms. And one of the nice things about GAC is that it can have multiple benefits. So we're hopeful that as we move forward with other rules in the future, there'll be additional benefit that we'll experience from the implementation of GAC at these facilities, because GAC is kind of a generic technology that is effective in the removal of a lot of these organic contaminants. So we're hoping to see additional benefit as we move down the road. But it's really difficult to roll that into an RIS.
Got it. One other just kind of high-level question I had was, you talk in the RIS about, if there's an exceedance, kind of the option, there'll be flexibility for the source to get it back under the level,
Mhm.
however they best see fit, right? They don't
Right.
have to install the GAC if there's.
Absolutely.
They can go to, somewhere that, some other pathway that the contaminant has to the source and fix it that way. They're free to do that.
Yeah.
What I didn't see in the rules, and maybe it's just a technical issue, maybe it's in another set of another rule set or something, but where does it talk about, I didn't see where it talked about enforcement, like where the department would come in and enter into a consent order, or, somebody exceeds the levels, they've done the sampling, they're over the MCL. Just talk me through practically what happens
Yeah.
then. What does the department do, and where is that described in
I'm going to
in law?
defer this to
Yeah.
you, but before I do. So just to be clear, before we enter into something like that, we always make many good faith effort to work with the supply to ensure that they're in compliance. So it's not, we don't automatically move into enforcement once an MCL has been hit. It's a process, and so we definitely try to work with the supply to achieve compliance and get them back under the MCL. But in certain circumstances, sure, it does kick off enforcement action, Chris.
Yeah, and sometimes there's also, I think, a semantic distinction in what we mean by enforcement too, correct? I mean, if somebody is over an MCL, we do issue a violation of the MCL, which triggers their Tier 2 public notification. So there's some enforcement happening there, but it's not escalated enforcement that usually brings someone under an administrative consent order. So there are some actions that are taken based on things you saw within the regulatory oversight and the references we made up in the presentation. But I think when it comes to moving into escalated enforcement, or sometimes folks will enter into an ACO, a non-punitive ACO, an administrative consent agreement, to just get the timeline spelled out in that administrative consent order, and kind of build in a structure for everybody to move forward on a timeline that will accomplish the goal of getting it corrected. And if people fail to stick to the administrative consent order, there can be additional enforcement taken as a result of that. But it's trying to leave some flexibility because every supply circumstance is different. So it's not prescriptive in the rule exactly what happens and on exactly what schedule, because I think every system situation is a little bit different.
Okay, so that's what I was trying to confirm. I didn't see in there where it's.
Yeah, it's
if you
not
exceed-
prescriptive in
if you
that
exceed
sense.
here, this is the consequence.
Mhm.
If it's
There
not
there
set
are
forth.
on the things like you're over an MCL, this is a violation, and here's the mandatory language for PN. You know, there is, if you fail to monitor appropriately, you must issue a monitoring violation and notify the public. That stuff is prescriptive, but as to how to solve the long-term MCL, there's more flexibility built in than that.
To follow up on that, what we're looking at is it's an amendment to Act 399, correct?
Yes.
No, these are rule revisions
Oh,
and rule
yeah,
revisions.
you're right. I'm
Now, this
sorry.
is not the
You're right.
statute.
This is the rule that applies under Act 399.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yep. Mark, did you?
Yeah, you know, we talked about the cost tonight. You mentioned that you didn't have anything in here on in disposal. Is there any incinerators in Michigan where they could take it? Is there?
I don't know.
Yeah.
The answer is no.
No, so you know, that's gonna be an additional disposal cost, no incinerators in Michigan. And then, landfills, I understand, you know, it's gonna be PFAS contaminated, carbon, and already there's landfills that won't take dry biosolids because of PFAS. So, you know, there's gonna be a significant cost for disposal, that wasn't factored into this. And then also, I had a question, you know, we got the briefing from the Science Advisory Panel on all the other states and stuff. Was it determined that, you know, the scientists that Michigan had, their results were better than the other states that had higher numbers?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Okay, well, you know, the scientists in Michigan came down with these low numbers. The scientists in New Hampshire, 70, 38, you know, which scientists are better? You know, which analysis?
Well, I really can't speak to that. What we did was, we just looked at it from the perspective of MPART had designated a group of folks to come up with this number. They had a process in place and they provided us with the numbers. We then took those numbers and did an analysis to determine whether or not those numbers were achievable. And so that was our charge. Our charge wasn't to determine, you know, the scientific process that was utilized to determine those numbers.
Yeah.
I don't know if you were at the June meeting, but I thought they did a good job of trying to explain the relative relationship between the numbers that they chose and why, science-based, average, all that kind of stuff. So I felt like they tried to actually provide an answer to that in that presentation.
If I can add to that, I think one of the things that they mentioned is that, especially Minnesota was using the same model that they're using, which basically they developed it themselves, kinetical model, which looks at the bioaccumulation of it. And the only difference between their one and theirs is that Minnesota relies on
PBA reference dose data versus they're using more the ASDR data, and that basically brought it down to the 6 parts per trillion as a recommendation versus the 14, which Mcls uses, if you look at that. So it is based on judgment by the toxicologists, and the group that we have, they found the ASDR data is much better than the PBA reference dose medicine. And that was excellent.
I'm curious if we know how close to the threshold numbers, the proposed threshold numbers, those 22 systems are.
We have all those results posted online. Ian, do you want to speak to that a little bit?
Sure. Don't have any sort of statistics on it, but I do have a list here. Particularly, we're looking at exceedances of PFO and PFOS in almost every case. Okay. One instance of an exceedance of PFNA. That one in particular was about double the MCL. Okay. PFO and PFOS, just looking at it broadly, for PFOS you have a range of 18 up to 170. Okay. So quite a variety. For PFO, we're looking at from 9 up to 37. Okay. So a variety there.
And they pretty much ran the gamut within those ranges. Okay.
Grant?
I've been struggling for some time now to try to put some perspective on this whole process. And a lot of this discussion sort of leads into an observation I want to make and then focus on a point. And Deb knows this, we've sat through multiple conversations about developing different criteria over the years. And to Fatah's point, the professionals have to make judgments. So you get a judgment on top of a judgment on top of a judgment, which makes approximately X times approximately Y equals Z. We are so bent as a society to come up with a number. We believe that 8 parts per billion is the right number, but the process used to develop that number is imprecise by its very nature. And so I think if we were to focus on the debate whether that number is the right number or whether we should change the number is probably a fruitless effort, a futile effort. Because when Dr. Gray did her summary before, we had like 8 different numbers for PFAS, and the question I posed to her was, well, which is the right one? And the room kind of chuckled a little bit. I think this discussion's headed in the direction of how do you address, quote, violation? Because I'd suggest if you reviewed with the members who developed the advisory numbers, what's the material difference between 12 and 14 or 14 and 18? You'd probably get the answer. There really isn't a material difference because the manner in which they're developed. So the heart, to me, it hit it where Robert was on this, if we're going to enter into an administrative order and deal with compliance questions, the heart of whether we have a salvageable, functional regulatory program is going to be on that side of the equation. Not on whether we debate whether the number's right, because that's a futile effort, I think. So the questions about how enforcement is handled, when orders get entered into, the time it takes to come into compliance, if you can come into compliance, is probably the heart of whether this is going to be a successful effort. I have seen evidence throughout the department of recognition of this principle, and I think Steve Schleiber does a great job of summing up the fact that we don't have all the answers right now. But I think that there is a couple of issues here I'd like to step into for a second. Following that observation, there's a statement that these rules, there are surface water standards and groundwater cleanup standards. The groundwater cleanup standards will be changed as a result of this rule. What section are you referring to? This is the answer to question number 3 in the regulatory impact statement. I suggest that that statement has a greater impact than whether the number is 8 or 12, because the impact statement doesn't discuss the impact on remediation activities in the state as a result of that observation. So if the MCLs, which I believe in, I'm not going to put Peter on this spot to confirm that, but I think the rules in the statute under 201 make the MCLs automatically groundwater remediation standards, and there's no discussion in the impact statement about that impact. So I would just oppose, do we have something here that we should be recognizing as a part of this process, these rules are adopted, what's the impact on remediation in the state of Michigan? I don't hear drinking water, I don't expect you to
Yeah.
necessarily answer it, I'm asking the question.
Yeah.
For the good of the common discussion here, understanding the impact of the rules.
Yeah. And, you know, our response was in the context of Public Act 399 and the drinking water rules. And so, you know, if you start looking at 201 criteria, that's kind of beyond the scope of what we were doing. What we were trying to achieve in the RIS was to at least flag that and recognize that there is something that's going to be triggered beyond the scope of just our program, but we're really not the ones to speak to that.
I kind of wonder a little bit about my understanding of the profile of the 20 or 22 supplies that are in non-compliance. That they're smaller, and I think Mark observed it's less than 50,000 gallons a day in supply. That the impact on those smaller facilities might be greater than you suggested. I can't conclude that, I'm just making that as an observation, that maybe that's something that needs to be looked at more closely. And the second thing is, we need to recognize adopting these rules change the cleanup standards under the 201 program. And I just think that it's, in terms of clarity and being thorough and thoughtful about our review, we have to recognize that.
Grant, just ask a question on that, just for those of us who aren't as close to that program.
I don't mean to put the drinking water division on the spot to determine the impacts of the 201 program. So I don't mean to, I'm making more of an observation that I think we have to collectively consider in adopting the rules. There's an impact on the 201 program that hasn't been discussed yet.
Yeah, it's a great point. My question to you, and let me answer that. That's a statutory, because of the statute, when these MCLs are adopted, they'll automatically apply to.
Between
So it's not
201
something that can
statute
be-
and the 201 rules,
Okay.
it's pretty clear that adopted MCLs under the State Drinking Water Act become cleanup criteria for residential drinking water in Part 201.
Got it. And that's not something that could, whether it's a good thing or bad thing, we can talk about, but that's not something that could be corrected in these rules. I mean, maybe theoretically it could, but more of a legal point than anything, but,
Well,
you know, it kind of affects the scope of our inquiry.
all right. I think the only way we can function is we have to be candid. And in an open meeting context, I will be candid about this. I'm not suggesting that for the good of the drinking water program of the state of Michigan, that we not move forward with these rules because the impact statement didn't take into consideration the cost impact potential in the 201 cleanup program. I think it is not necessarily honest on our part to ignore it though, and say that, okay, the secondary, maybe primary impact of these rules is on the 201 program. We have to figure that out. Do we say we're not going to address the drinking water program because we think the impact of the 201 program is too great? That strikes me as being counter, and James and I have talked about a few things here, counter to where the state needs to go to protect drinking water supplies. I'm just saying that we have to recognize that there's another impact there. We have to figure out what we do about it. I'm not advocating right now that we not adopt these rules because we don't know that impact yet. I just think that somewhere in the context, particularly on the enforcement side of this, and I see evidence of that right now, the department recognizes this, the biosolids program. There's a review being done right now about the biosolids program. And there's a recognition, if you're not careful, we could say to all the municipal wastewater treatment plants in the state of Michigan, you can't land apply anymore. The impact that that could have when there's no incinerator capacity and landfills won't take it is where do you send it? So there's a lot of secondary impacts to how we're going to manage and regulate PFAS going forward that we just are going to have to be aware of and figure out how we deal with it. To be blunt, I think it would be a disservice to water supplies in the state of Michigan if we hung it up because we haven't figured out everything else yet. Because if we wanted to wait to figure out everything else, we'd do nothing. Because there's a lot that still has to be figured out. But I just wanted to acknowledge that the statement acknowledged the groundwater standards would be changed. And we're gonna have to deal with that. And I just want everybody to appreciate approval of these rules will affect the 201 program. And anybody who has to deal with that program.
And Grant, just for your background, I was contacted by several other outside members and such, raising the same question and concern. You know, that is gonna have some effects in the part two.
Anyone else have questions for?
Yeah, Robert, I could. I wanted to return to page 4 of the RIS, and Robert asked some questions about the projected cost for installation of the treatment systems already. I just wanted a little bit of clarification there. I know the department had reported those costs based on the state of New Hampshire study, and the cost is quoted as a per gallon per day.
Mm-hmm.
I assume that that's not really true from gallon 1. However, that there is some minimum cost no matter how small the system is that's being treated. Is that a fair statement?
Well, yeah, I mean, what throws the equation askew is if you have a really small system, you know, even a moderate initial cost is going to have a weighted impact on that, because you're going to have fewer gallons to be covered by that initial cost. So this was an attempt to basically utilize the model that New Jersey had put together, and we plugged those in. So there will be some variability, and I do acknowledge that the smaller systems, the per unit cost is, for the initial cost, is going to be higher because you don't have those economies of scale.
Okay, yeah. And then, I mean, sort of related, just because I took a look at the 22 systems that were flagged, and they all looked like they were fairly small systems. More smaller communities, trailer parks, some private businesses, whatnot. And so I did have a little bit of question, maybe concern, about the summary statement that was made to question 16. And I'll just read that. That's about the impact that the rule will have on rural areas. And it said, in general, rural areas will be less impacted by these rules than urban, since most contamination found to date occurs in larger systems. And that seemed to be contrary to the 22 systems that were flagged, the types of systems that they were. And then, kind of very related, question 20, identify any disproportionate impact on small businesses. And I understand that not all the 22 were small businesses. Some of them were just small municipalities and schools. But it said small businesses should be impacted less by this regulation since they treat a lower volume of water than municipalities due to their size and less urban location. Again, that just didn't seem to match up with that list that was released by the department of the 22 systems that were flagged. So,
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if you want to speak to either of those. Or.
Well, I understand what you're saying. So really you have two concepts going on. You've got raw cost, and certainly a smaller system, when you're talking about raw numbers, it's going to be a smaller number. But when you amortize that over the amount of water that's treated, the cost per gallon on the smaller systems will be larger, and you're absolutely right.
I just want to say, I'm glad where you landed with your comments, Grant, because any policy with a complex issue like this, there are going to be implications elsewhere. But if we don't move forward, I'm sure there's some that we aren't even identifying now. And that's what adaptive management is about. And that's where we set rules best we know, but then they can be, as time goes on, I just caution us, there's important policies in the country that are needed, yet the perfect is the enemy of the good, and so we just have to get started because it's too important. I think also cost, when it comes to the cost and the implications on all of these, I think overall there's many conversations going on outside of this that there are communities that won't be able to afford what's necessary to address drinking water. And the state has to figure out what its role is, and citizens have to figure out what their role is, but that's not a reason to not move forward when we know that there are concerns that have to be addressed. So there are things that are going to have to be decided in other forums about addressing those issues and costs. So, and this will help that get defined because then we'll know what the implications are.
I have had so many conversations in the last 7 or 8 months about this stuff that I have to try to digest every once in a while. I'd like to find a forum where we could have some reasoned conversation, maybe even bring back some of the Science Advisory Group about the fundamental question of is there a material difference between 14 and 12? And that really goes to the question of where you go with enforcement. We are, as a society, everybody drives to a number, and I've been doing this for a long time, and I think the difference between 12 parts per trillion and 13 parts per trillion is beyond our scientific ability to conclude as a material difference. And so, I think, so that, as I said, to have a dispute now about whether it should be 8 or 12 or 15, I think is futile. But the question is, what do we do about 12 when the standard's 10? That's the heart of where we need to go with this, because I'm not so sure 12 is a real difference from 10, but will create the impression. Because that's what people look to, is if it's 8 and you've got 9, that's bad. In fact, there's one thing I needed to ask. I went back and looked at the way the rules are written in the health effects language. And we're dealing with a substance that clearly the criteria has been developed based on the number of X years of exposure. The health effects language says, for example, with respect to PCBs, some people who drink water containing PCBs in excess of the MCL over many years could experience changes in their skin. What we say with respect to each of the PFAS, let me go directly to PFOS. Some fetuses and/or infants born to mothers drinking water containing PFAS in excess of the MCL may experience developmental delays and decreased body weight gain. How many times do they have to drink to experience an adverse effect? This implies that a single exposure could result in developmental delays. And that really worries me, because I don't think that's technically correct. Because, and I'm not suggesting, okay, we should let all infants drink PFAS. I'm just saying, have we created a risk communication problem by the statement in here on the health effects language? Deb's making a note right now. So I'm not asking an immediate answer to it, but put some thought into whether that's the right way to say it. Because the first time I read it, I said, well, wait a minute, does that mean a single exposure? And I think the only single exposure that, I should pause, the one I'm most familiar with is TCE as a single exposure risk for vapor intrusion. So can you look at that, Deb, or have some discussion with your people whether that's, are we creating an impression that a single exposure is a problem? And I have a stepdaughter who's pregnant with her second grandchild. So I think about this stuff.
Grant, to add to your conversation, I think for everybody around the table that would have to make a decision, we need to understand from the regulatory perspective. From the regulatory perspective, when you start talking about, the number is 12 but what if it's 14? The reason that we have to have a number is because of, in our legal system, there's lawyers, okay? And if I'm the regulator, and the number's 12, but 14, that's pretty close to 12, and I think technically it's probably not, it's about the same. And I don't do something, and there comes harm to the person that I didn't take the action to, there's gonna be lawyers that are gonna get a lot of money for people because I didn't follow the rule. So I think we gotta be careful. I understand what you're saying about there is going to be an impact, but the number has to be the number. We can't, it is the whatever the number is, that's the number. And if they don't meet the number, there has to be action taken, or the person that's overseeing that supply, the regulator, is gonna be held accountable or could be held accountable. And that's, I'm not gonna be held accountable because I did my job. I did my job because it says 12 and they were 14. They've gotta get it under 12. See what I mean?
All well taken, and I completely understand that, and I've also made the prior observation that one of the biggest problems in the PFAS world is uncertainty. These standards will create more certainty from the standpoint of what is my target, what do I have to deal with here? And that covers everybody. And so there's value in reducing the uncertainty. I just think that in some context, an effort to look at the enforcement side of this thing and try to understand the complexities of the PFAS world, it's incumbent on us to do that. I'm not suggesting, as I said, how long do you think we could debate what the numbers should be, Deb?
Right, I understand that,
Yeah,
but
so-
once we are done debating.
Right.
And we choose the number.
Yeah.
That's the number.
Yeah. So if
And
I.
then, you know, we can't really go, can't waffle.
So if I could speak to this, because I agree with you completely. I mean, we have to, from a regulatory standpoint, have a number. However, as you indicated, because you bring up a really good point, oftentimes there's this gray area, which is exactly why in the rules we have those conditions where we may request a system to do additional analyses. We may request that they go to quarterly or do these other things because we see something that while it's not a violation, it concerns us. We want to monitor it. And, you know, as he indicated, the number is the number. So if we see something that kind of concerns us, we're going to look a little bit deeper into it. And if it turns out that it was just an anomaly, then fine, that's what it was. But if all of a sudden we find out that that was a trend that was building upwards, now we've been a little bit more proactive, and once we cross that threshold, then we take that additional step.
Any more questions for field staff? Yeah, Dave.
Just looking at the criteria that, the 5 criteria that this body has to look at, one of the criteria, I think it's 4C in our act, is that the draft rules are necessary and suitable to achieve their purposes in proportion to the burdens they place on individuals and businesses. And you indicated you had some discussion, you had some stakeholder meetings this summer prior to the rules being developed the rules and then got them out and then had a follow-up. And you mentioned that you did make some changes to the rules where there were some inconsistencies.
Right.
But I didn't hear anything from you about the stakeholders feeling that they are in proportion to the burdens that you're placing on them to achieve the objective here. What kind of feedback did you hear from the stakeholders regarding the burdens that they're going to experience? Whether it be, you know, the sampling frequencies, I mean, the MCLs are the MCLs, but just implementing the whole process, what kind of burdens are these going to be placing on the stakeholders?
Well, it's funny you said, you know, with respect to the MCL, set that aside. That's where the discussion was. You know, some groups feel that the number should be higher, some groups feel that the number should be lower. With respect to the actual monitoring process itself, and feel free to weigh in here, Chris, but it didn't seem as though there was a lot of concern because we tried to frame it as closely as we could to an existing process. So this really wasn't anything new in terms of the process itself. It's just an additional analysis that they would need to do. So from that standpoint, I didn't feel that we had a very substantial amount of pushback.
No, there was not a lot of direct conversation about the sampling frequencies. It was more about the numbers.
It was just about the focus was
More
on,
so.
Yeah.
On the number.
Because if you don't meet the number, there would be a
There's
much
bigger
larger
consequence.
consequence
Right, but there is addition, so I guess that's one of my concerns, is there's additional sampling going on, additional testing that you're going to have to do, but it's being done in conjunction with the existing sampling and testing that the facilities are already doing.
It's being done within a similar framework,
Yeah.
so, yeah.
Yeah.
So what's the number of the group, of your data, what's the number that are already in compliance? Like is 80% of
Well-
what you've been testing, like they're in compliance right
90.
now?
Well, it depends on what you mean by compliance, so I'll frame it this way. As I indicated before, 90% of the systems that we tested in the initial survey had non-detect across the board. we had an additional 6% that had less than 10 parts per trillion total PFAS. And that was a combination of all 14 of those compounds that were analyzed under 537. And then we had those 22 systems that, if the MCLs as proposed went into effect today, we'd have those 22 systems that would have an issue that we would need to work with in order to bring them back into compliance.
22 out of about.
But you haven't sampled all of your supplies yet. You said of the supplies you've sampled. Have all the supplies been sampled?
The community supplies, yes, not all the non-community, non-transients, but a very good portion of those. So there's about 400 or so, Ian, 600, approximately 600 non-community, non-transients. Go ahead,
It
Ian.
also includes community water supplies who are purchasing their water from
Others. So out of the 600 non-community, non-transients, just a certain number haven't been sampled yet?
out of those.
You said that
There's 600 that have not been.
Have not
There's
been.
1,300 total.
So there's 600, there, about 50% have been sampled.
A little
The
over.
Non-community, non-transients.
The community is about 1,400 and they all have.
So the
separate
22 number could go up a little.
Yeah, if they were to follow statistically what we've seen, you know, you're probably talking about another half dozen
Yeah,
or so.
6, yeah.
Ron?
Yeah, not to hammer on the same issue, which is going back to the MCL, but I believe when Eric was talking, I think Eric Oswald was talking about that, once the advisory group proposed a health-based value, then the process is that would be a floor for the MCL unless you justify a higher number. As you went through the process of developing the MCL, have you
Mhm.
given any weight to other states' MCL? And coming
No,
back
we
into- or
did.
you just went with that and looked
We,
at just
yeah,
MDL
so
method
our
progression?
process was, these are the numbers that we've been provided. We're not going to take into consideration other studies because that was the charge of the Science Advisory Work Group. Our charge was to say, these numbers as they're provided, is this something that can be implemented in Michigan within reason? So again, going back to those criteria that we were looking at was analytical capability, analytical capacity, what are the number of supplies that would be impacted, what would be the cost of that. Those were the factors that we took into consideration, and since we felt that those were all reasonable, we simply went with the Science Advisory Work Group numbers.
Thanks.
Any more questions? Okay. Thank you very much for
Thank
the
you.
presentation. I appreciate it. So I think the next item on the agenda is public comment. We kind of moved this up, but it's typically at the end, but before more deliberations, we wanted to hear from folks who they participated in the stakeholder process or not, or just have a comment on the proposed rules now that they've been out there for a few weeks. Wanted to hear your feedback, so I'll just go down the list here and call out your name, and is there a particular place they should go to speak, Dave?
They could sit right here by the, where George is sitting, would be fine. But yeah, we'd like you to come to the table.
Yeah, and I'd ask you to try to limit your comments to 3 minutes, because we've got a few to get through here and more on the agenda as well, so. Charlotte from the Michigan Environmental Council.
Hi, I'm Charlotte Jameson. I'm Program Director with the Michigan Environmental Council, and I oversee our drinking water program. And I will definitely keep my comments brief. I just wanted to strongly urge the committee today to move forward with the rules and not delay them any further. Communities across Michigan that are struggling with toxic PFAS contamination are calling out for stronger protections and have been for well over a year now. We need certainty and we need protections in place for people's health and well-being. Eagle also, as mentioned here, conducted a very thorough stakeholder process, which Michigan Environmental Council engaged. And stakeholders were given already ample time to weigh in on the rule package as it exists now. And we think the rules, while not perfect, should be moved on to the stage of public comment. We really think that it's time for Michiganders to have a say in the rule package and to be able to voice their own opinion. Unfortunately, any delay that this committee makes is a delay in that public comment period. And so we would really urge you to not do that and to allow this to move forward. Finally, I believe there are members of this committee who have a direct financial conflict of interest in this rule package. And I would strongly encourage them to disclose that financial conflict of interest and to recuse themselves from a vote on this package. I think you do a disservice to the people of Michigan when there is that inherent bias and that inherent financial conflict of interest in voting on something that is to the benefit of Michigan's public health. So with that, I will conclude my testimony. Thank you.
Thank you. David Wynn from Need Our Water Group in Oscoda.
My name is David Wynn. I represent Need Our Water in Oscoda. We have a little different situation in Oscoda. We're at Wordsmith Air Force Base. We have the Air Force that we have to deal with, not only the private corporations. Based on the 70 parts per trillion guideline that's currently standard now, Air Force continues to drag their feet and not do anything to remediate, using the CERCLA process as their excuse. In the past year, we've had PFAS foam on a lot of the lakes, primarily with Annette Lake, with high concentrations of PFAS. Deer population has been affected. The Do Not Eat Fish advisory in the Asabo property values in Oscoda have declined. Vacation rentals have declined 38%, and it goes on and on. The Air Force at this point doesn't know what they're going to do, and it could be years before they have any type of filtration system or any kind of remediation plan. I'm here today in order to recommend that we do not delay in this MCL and we move forward and get this thing straightened out so that they and all the corporations and people that are affected by the contamination get things taken care of immediately versus doing it when they feel like it. Thank you.
Thank you. Stephen Brown, the Sierra Club.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Stephen Brown. I have a PhD in chemistry. I've worked in the drug discovery industry, and so I have both formal training and practical experience in analytical chemistry, including mass spectrometry, toxicology, and drug metabolism, as well as chemical synthesis. And I'm here representing the Sierra Club. I'm a resident of Ann Arbor, one of the communities that's been affected by PFAS contamination in the Huron River. And I would urge this committee to approve these draft rules without any further delay. I can't think of a more egregious violation of the public trust by the chemical manufacturing industry in exposing the entire population of these compounds for many, many decades. I think these rules are reasonable. They're a reasonable compromise among the cost burden for monitoring, for compliance, for treatment, and to protect the public health. They're also fully consistent with MCL levels that have been considered by other states. So I would again urge you all to please approve the current rules the draft rules as they exist and pass them on through the chain of consideration. Right. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Laura Campbell from the Michigan Farm Bureau.
Good afternoon. My name's Laura Campbell from Michigan Farm Bureau, and I appreciate being able to speak to the committee today. One of the things that I wanted to bring up, and I think this follows along with a lot of the discussion that was had by this committee this afternoon, which I really found very gratifying that other people are seeing this concern as well, is the disproportionate effect that costs of implementing this program are likely to be seen by a lot of our smallest communities and our smallest suppliers. And I wanted to make sure that the committee is aware that a lot of these smallest type 2 non-transient, non-community supplies are farms and agricultural processors. They don't have the option to pass their costs on to ratepayers. They don't have the option to raise their prices to accommodate for these costs. And so I think that between that and then also Mr. Traeger's comments about cleanup standards are also things that have to be taken into account when we're moving forward with having standards in the state for enforcement, for compliance with MCLs, as well as for other standards that are affected by them. So I thank you for the discussion you've had already, and hope you'll continue to consider that issue. Thanks.
Thank you. Is Richards from the Michigan Municipal League?
Good afternoon. My name is Harrison Richards. I'm representing the Michigan Municipal League. So we've been involved in this process since the spring, and first and foremost, I want to thank the department for their work to facilitate this process, to provide engaging and transparent conversations. We were given questions that we could ask our community members, the ones who were closest to this problem, about what they were currently doing and what they expected in this process. And so over the past 10 months, it's been really great for our members to have the opportunity to work with this Science Advisory Work Group, with this body, and part in the department to better understand and address PFAS contamination in Michigan. And from what was provided by our members and what we discussed with the department, it's evident that they've done the best of their ability to incorporate the feedback that was provided for what we know on this issue. With that being said, delivering affordable, clean, quality drinking water is a priority for our community, and I want to recognize that we have many communities that already have gone above and beyond and spent several $1 million to mitigate this problem on their own, and that should be recognized. And so as you consider adopting these rules, we hope you recognize that our communities are still navigating addressing the cost of contamination. We've been provided with estimates which are helpful, but as we discussed today, there's still many things such as disposal, the accessibility of grants, bonds, technical assistance, and more that hasn't really been addressed. And I think as we move forward with the urgency that is necessary, we continue those conversations in good favor. So we are happy. We will be at the table continuing these conversations, working to make sure that this is something that is acceptable for our communities, that is actionable for our communities, because it's a priority we have. To protect the drinking water of our constituents is a charge that we tremendously care about. And so we are happy to continue having those necessary conversations, and thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
You don't have to talk that fast to get it done in 2 minutes.
See if I slow down.
The only reason I said that is someone I used to work with, we used to have a competition who could speak faster during our presentations. So, thank you.
Well, if there's anything I can reiterate, I'm happy to do so. Thank you so much. Thanks.
Okay. Well, these are the ones that were, I think this. Did anyone? Yeah, I got them. Did anyone who wanted to speak not get a chance? I think yes. There was two. Oh, okay. Oh, I'm sorry. It's okay. You're right. Thanks, Mark. It's great vice chair work right there.
My name is Jamie Fleming. I work for the City of Wyoming as a laboratory manager for the Utilities Department. I'm also the chair-elect for the Michigan Section American Water Works Association, and I'm here in that role today. I was able to attend both of the rulemaking listening sessions, and I appreciated the transparency, active listening, and cooperative spirit on the part of Eagle's representatives. Throughout the conversations, it was evident that everyone in the room, no matter the group they represented, was approaching the rules from the perspective of what is in the best interest of public health. The listening sessions were conversational with open dialogue, not just about the rules at hand, but also stretching into the broader topic of PFAS and the tough questions and challenges that remain ahead of us. As for the feedback given on the rules, much of what was brought to the table from the stakeholders in the sessions I attended were reflected in the final form. I understand it's not possible to create rules that are a perfect fit for every interested group, but the proposed rules appear to be straightforward and do follow a framework that we are familiar with for other existing regulatory patterns. Additionally, there are key places where the rule language is appropriately flexible, for instance, in the allowable treatment technologies for the approval of alternative testing methods. Because our understanding of the science is developing alongside the rules and will continue after they are in place, this flexibility is crucial. EGLE has been very forthcoming with details of implementation, intention, and application that can't be detailed in a regulatory framework. It is clear that EGLE has done a significant amount of work to anticipate challenges and questions that will arise as the rules go into effect, and I commend this effort as it feels like a very different approach from other processes. As many voices shared with EGLE in the listening sessions, there are some key points that must remain in the forefront of the broader conversation, and many of those were brought up today. Michigan has done great things through the great work of MPART, and their efforts have put public health first while being grounded in science. Our understanding of PFAS is unfolding and will continue to unfold well past the implementation of rules for just the 7 compounds. It's imperative that we continue to approach PFAS in a science-forward way, always focusing on what is best for public health. In the realm of drinking water, that will mean carefully assessing and balancing PFAS with other elements of water quality. Protecting public health comes with a price tag, and I know that drinking water professionals across the state take up this responsibility with the utmost care and dedication. But make no mistake, the cost of additional requirements for monitoring and in some cases implementing treatment is not insignificant. In the end, utilities will balance competing priorities, and that most often falls to the ratepayers to fund those efforts. As we move forward with the rules and with others already in place, the availability of funding sources must continue to be an ongoing important discussion in order to provide safe drinking water in an affordable and equitable way. Creating drinking water standards for PFAS is just one piece of the puzzle. These standards cannot stand alone without real enforceable protections for our source water. We must find a way to break the PFAS cycle, and this requires that we continue the holistic approaches through bodies like MPART. Michigan's leading the way, and we look forward to the continuation of that work.
Thank you. I have Mara Herman from the Ecology Center.
Hi, thank you again. My name is Mara Herman. I'm a public health professional and the health policy specialist at the Ecology Center. Thank you so much for your time and the ability to provide a comment. On behalf of the Ecology Center, I want to reiterate what has been already said by several comments already made. I urge you to move forward with the rulemaking process as it's best for public health. PFAS are extremely persistent in the environment, and some of them build up in people and animals. Once they are in our bodies, they stick around with half-lives in people up to 8 years. Exposure to these compounds has been linked to a number of health concerns, including cancer, hormone disruption, harm to the immune system, and liver, kidney, reproductive, and developmental toxicity. Again, thank you for your time, and I urge you to move forward with the rulemaking process.
Thank you. Okay. If there's no further public comment, then I think we'll move on to the next agenda item, which is deliberation on the draft rules. So I think, we'll just sort of open it up for discussion among the committee. I would note that Peter Manning from the Attorney General's office is available to support. As you know, the AG's office has been to a few of our meetings, and so to advise us on FOIA, things like that. So I guess if we have any specific legal questions that we can't answer ourselves, we have Peter as a resource too. So, I know there's been some discussion already, but let's kind of kick it off on the committee.
Could we just review real quick before the 4 categories that they've brought up that we would be deliberating about?
Yeah.
Well, it's not our options. It's the 4 things we're the criteria.
So the 5 criteria that we are comparing the rules against are, first, the office, used to be the MOR, the Rulemaking Office, has certified that the draft proposed rules do not exceed the rulemaking delegation contained in the statute authorizing the rulemaking. So they're authorized to promulgate the rules. Number two, the draft proposed rules reasonably implement and apply the statute authorizing the rulemaking and are consistent with all other applicable law. Number three, the draft proposed rules are necessary and suitable to achieve their purposes in proportion to the burdens they place on individuals and businesses. Number four, the draft proposed rules are as clear and unambiguous as reasonably appropriate, considering the subject matter of the proposed rules and the individuals and businesses that will be required to comply with the proposed rules. And then finally, the draft proposed rules are based on sound and objective scientific reasoning. So those are the criteria that we're charged with evaluating the rules against.
I think Dave's trying to get them up there.
Ready.
Yeah.
Perfect.
So, we can blow that up.
And at the top of the meeting, I talked about sort of what our options are. I guess this is technically the next item on the agenda, but what our options are for this meeting in terms of proceeding, which would be checking ourselves out of the review process entirely, letting them go through the normal rulemaking process, voting to allow the rules to proceed to a public hearing, or really two other options, determining that the draft proposed rules do not meet the criteria, or determining that additional review is needed to determine whether the draft rules meet the criteria. So those are kind of our options at this meeting. Anyone want to share initial thoughts? Yeah, Helen?
I think we should let it go forward, but I don't know if I should make a motion, because I feel like we've done a lot of deliberation, but
I have a question that may be helpful to the group, which is, what is the process of looking at MCLs and reviewing MCLs in the state? Is there a process around that? If you establish an MCL, is there a process by which you go back and visit those?
I would just flag the recent revision of the copper rule. As far as I know, that's the one instance where the department has went back, looked at an MCL and changed it recently. But it's like any other rule, they're always kind of available to go back and look at them. Most of the other rules currently under Michigan State Drinking Water Act are the federal numbers, and we've adopted the federal rules.
Right, so it would just be a matter of going back through the full rulemaking process again to make further amendments.
I just wanted to understand that.
Yes, I'll just add a couple other comments. I really have appreciated the process that they've gone through, and it also signals to me that just when you have that many people that have had an opportunity to comment and they feel going forward is important. I want to honor that. I also think that if we're really talking about until November 21st, I guess I would question what this body of people would do in that time that would make a significant difference in analysis and such. What I do think is great is our minutes are usually pretty high level. I think it would be great. Some of these implications are things that are really important for all kinds of reasons, costs, et cetera. Not that we're going to solve those, but I think it's important to capture the comments of the conversation that really talk about these other implications. This is new ground we're forging, and we are learning, and I think things will come back around and we will adapt, and that's what good policy making is about.
I think one point that Grant raised earlier is looking at some of the effects that this has outside of this process with the Part 201, for example. I know that I've been contacted by several folks to ask to delay to the next meeting just for some more evaluation of those impacts outside of this actual move.
Question. It's my understanding that only, PFOS and I think PFOA would be subject to 201. So that the other 5, come back to your RC? Is that the case in only those two?
You know, that's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. I think, in MCL, one section of the rules say if it's an MCL, it gets adopted under 201. So the question is whether the Gen X and others would become a 201 criteria. I don't know the answer. That's a good question. Since we spent so much time focusing on PFOS and PFOA, we haven't thought about that much.
I guess from this is just my perspective, my vote doesn't carry any more weight than anyone else's. I think the question, from my perspective, it's also important to understand what the cost burdens are going to be on the locals for putting these treatment technologies in place. I mean, if it's $7.5 million across, spread across 22 different sources, that gives me a lot less heartburn than if it's 10 or 15 million per location to kind of put this technology in place. So I'd like to hear an answer to that as well. And I hear the point about the 201 implications of this as well. I do have some concerns about, again, not about necessarily the levels here, but have we really, I'm not on the technical side of things, but I want to make sure that we don't have any unintended consequences or aspects to these rules that maybe haven't been fully explored. I guess the question would be, kind of to Helen's point, what answers do we specifically need on the 201 side of things from the department, so that if we were to give ourselves some more time to explore some of these issues. I mean, are there specific, Dan and Grant, if you have thoughts on that, are there specific asks or requests or aspects of those unintended consequences that we want to explore specifically?
Let me make an observation. I think one of the challenges that we have is that we've never done this before. So we have a very important set of rules, and we're slogging our way through it the first time. And we've actually had some, I think, good conversations, but I can kind of get the sense there's a few issues out there yet. Maybe what we should consider is developing a list of questions that we'd seek to have responses back. Suggest we wrap it up on November 21st, and it would be a yay or nay on the 21st. Because I don't know how much more we could learn over 2 months. Some would argue, and Helen said she's looked at it very closely and she's comfortable, but maybe we should consider that. Put the other little questions, and I guess, David, we'd send them to you, and you'd figure out where those questions would go, and frankly, give whomever should respond to those the opportunity to prepare. And then we come back, we'll review them on the 21st, and it's a year at the end of the 21st. And that's in respect of the concerns that have been expressed about moving forward. I don't think that's an extended period of time. The rules came to us 10 days later than they might have. So another 21, is it 21 days? November tomorrow.
3 weeks,
yeah. Anyway, I would suggest that there might be a few questions out there that we even put on the table today that, Deb gets a chance to think about that language on that one section, She may come back and tell me I'm wrong. Why maybe? I mean, I don't know that it's a right or wrong. I think it's just is it reflected correctly. So I'd suggest that.
Rob, you asked a really good question about would any changes in this, though, address the questions we've been raising? Is there an actual word change that would address the fact that this will cost? So I guess what I would suggest we look are these questions ones that are answered by a different decision that we might make? Or are they really, we're identifying, there's a lot of unknowns, there are things that we're going to have to adjust and look at, but that doesn't materially change what's here. So I guess my counter to that is that let's make sure with eyes wide open that the issues we've raised here, which I don't think would change on the 21st from what's written here, but those are the things that we all as a society actually have to look at, and it's for other reasons, other issues of drinking water quality too. So I still don't know that those questions, I like a reasonable compromise, but I don't think that'll change. We would not have a change to the words here.
I
So-
think there may be two categories of what I suggested. Questions that might affect language and those that are issues that need to be managed going forward. That's what I think our exchange suggests to me. I'm not sure that there isn't something that might be modified here that would be appropriate. I'm not suggesting the numbers, I've made that pretty clear. But I think there are some things that would be worthwhile putting on the record in terms of the questions. And so that's as much as my thought.
Do we have any questions that'll change the language?
Well, I don't know. I mean, am I taking a slightly different view on that, because whether we have specific language changes or not, I think the questions that, at least the one about the numbers, I don't think it should be too difficult to answer. But that, and then probably the impact on the 201 program.
I'm not sure what that
might not lead
matters.
to language changes,
Right.
but it would impact our evaluation of the rules as they stand against the criteria. Like if it's going to cost, me personally, happy to hear more explanation on it or a different view, but if it's $15 million per source to put treatment technologies in place, not that it may ultimately change my vote on the rules, but changes how you weigh, the compliance with the criteria. So I'm not looking at it as like a markup of the rules and we gotta change this word here. It's more about, what burdens are these placing on, individuals, businesses, local governments, things like that.
And it gets to the 4C requirements.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, as it goes to 201, I mean, we have Eagle staff here. Like, can somebody clarify what applies and what doesn't?
James?
Well, I think we need to review that one a little more carefully. My understanding would be is that they could become Part 201 standards, that they would become Part 201 standards automatically. Although, then their application, like Graham said, and this is not to get into, there's a lot of enforcement issues out there where we have PFAS out there with biosolids and a number of other things where we're not gonna get it all perfect. So at a site-specific basis, we make determinations all the time about how we apply kind of the criteria going forward. So are there issues there? Yes. Should they, impact what we do to protect the public from drinking water? I don't think so. And I just want to remind the committee one other thing, which is that this rule can change more after this process. There's going to be public hearings. The department is authorized to basically make these tweaks we're talking about as part of the public process period going forward too. And I think some suggestions have been made that I think may result in tweaks to the rules. But that is that they're not set in stone once they leave here, just a reminder.
No, it's good perspective.
And we've got them up, Rob, on the screen here. These are our guardrails here, what we're under consideration.
Right.
For this group. And I think where you're coming down, they got a little blown up, Dave, if you could bring it down just a little bit. It is, I think, is it C?
C.
I think C is kind of where we have a little bit of heartburn right now amongst some of our members. Is that a good observation? A, check, right? B, is that for me, B is a check. C, I think for me is a check, but it sounds like there's some folks that have some questions. D is a check and E is a check. So I think we're really kind of zoned in on one piece.
And I think E, people may have concerns about E, I don't know that.
I don't know that.
Ultimately, we don't know
Yeah.
until we vote,
I think
if that's enough to get them to vote.
I think the
one way or
process
other.
that was used, and they used the science advisory, and they used the 3 university and we had our own state toxicologist review it, I'm settled on that it's based on science. We might not agree with this science, but it's based on sound objectives and science, in my opinion. So, it's hard to argue.
I think a lot of people haven't commented, so I think the only way we would really know how comfortable we are is if we actually take a vote, or are we at least going around the circle? Otherwise, just wait to go ahead and say anything.
Right. I have one other question for Dave and maybe Peter. I didn't bring my my APA with me, but is there an ability to go back and, for some of these questions that have been raised there's no limitation on amending the regulatory impact statement, is there? I mean, you could probably do that at any time to update that?
Yeah, I know the Michigan Office of Administrative Hearings and Rules, they have to approve our regulatory impact statement prior to the formal public hearing. And I don't believe they've approved it yet. I believe we're able to make amendments to the regulatory impact statement. So I think that is something we can do.
Yeah, okay. So I think that may be a good step as well.
Yeah, the only other concern with 4E was, there was sound science that was done from one study, but there was no comparison to any other states in terms of what that study resulted in sort of comparison.
Maybe go to Corey, because I think there has been significant, maybe Corey could speak to that for just a minute, if that might help.
Sure.
Sure. So Corey Gretsch, in my day job, I'm the Division Director for Environmental Health at the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services. Here I am also a rep on the MPART. And so with the Science Advisory Board, one of the parts that went into it was providing all the other states' numbers and documents. And so that did get handed over to the Science Advisory Work Group. They considered all of that. I would point you back to the governor's directive that was required. And it was evaluated, and that I think is laid out in pretty good detail in the actual report and presentation by Kevin Cox back in June.
So staffing is always a little bit of an issue, and we've got 600 more small, not, like, it looks like the work that was done was on targeted, that you knew were issues, and then there's this 600 that we're still waiting on that were add-ons, because it seems like as we kept defining the group, then it started getting into this, so we've got essentially 3 groups that we're looking at. So that last 600 that hasn't been tested yet, is there a timeline on testing them? Or is it kind of like, okay, we actually set priorities and we know, we had someone here from Oscoda that spoke, so we know that Oscoda is kind of very concerned about their situation. And so it's like, are we gonna start focusing on that sort of thing? I mean, that's the federal government that we're looking at with an Air Force issue. So is that how this whole thing is heading, or do we start going, okay, let's get the other 600 done, and then we start weighing this out and how we're gonna do this? Because that's the kind of stuff I'm looking at. It's like, when you start looking at actually going and giving an administrative, action to someone that they have to get into compliance, and we start kicking that bucket down the street, that's what I'm trying to figure out, because here we're talking, but once it goes into implementation, it's like, okay, is it the guy that does $1 million a year in his business, or is it the guy that does, $1.5 billion? Where are we going after with this? And so that's what I'm wondering, the impact of what we're talking about. Or is it the municipality that's just gonna have to pick it up? I mean, is that the focus that, like, the city of Flint has, they have a lead problem, but if it was PFAS, is that where we're heading? That sort of thing, where all of a sudden everybody's getting new water lines going into their homes? That's the kind of It's like, I'm not getting a real clear idea about how, when we get into implementing what our decision is, where are we going with this thing?
On the enforcement side.
That's exactly what I'm looking at. That's what I'm not hearing, and I'm missing that. You know, I was very happy to hear, okay, we're at 94, 96% compliance. We've got just this little piece of the pie over here. But, okay, so is it gonna be that 600 that pop up at the end that are gonna like take our numbers and like all of a sudden our $15 million deal turned into like, you know, 400 billion? I mean, I just don't know. So that, I just need a little bit of direction with that. And then, because, hey, I want clean drinking water just like the next guy. So it's like, I'm happy my water comes out of, you know, this particular municipality or runs this direction, or they built a new water line that, you know, now we know we've got great water for that, but where is it that the problem's going to be and how's it gonna manifest itself? So that's the question I wanna know. When they come in and write you that little piece of paper and you, all of a sudden it's like, you know, how are we targeting this thing? How are we going forward? So that's what I'm looking for. Just give me a little bit of a game plan.
Maybe a little bit more description of who that universe is, I think might be helpful.
Yeah, so if you go back to the survey, so the short answer to your question is there was no intention to have those 600 systems incorporated into that initial survey. We're just completing that survey up now. What we targeted was the community water supplies and then the most vulnerable non-community, non-transient water supplies. So that included schools that had their own water systems, daycares, elder care facilities, other such facilities along those lines. There are a number of other facilities that we determined based on, you know, the funding that we had to conduct the survey did not represent populations that we thought were at particular risk. Now, as we look at these systems, they're pretty much across the state. It's fairly widely geographically distributed. So as such, we believe that the numbers that we have right now are gonna hold up pretty well. But we have way over what you would consider to be a statistically significant population set to make a very educated guess as to what's gonna happen moving forward. So with respect to the 600 supplies that we haven't tested, more than likely the most intelligent answer is we're probably looking in the neighborhood of 1 to 2% of those are gonna potentially have an MCL issue. We don't think it's gonna be anywhere near, you know, 50% or anything like that. Every time we've incorporated a new population into this, the numbers fell out pretty much the same way each and every time.
So I looked at the map, it's like, there's a surprise location over here on the west side of the state. And it was like, I wonder whatever went on over there. And so what you're saying is as you keep testing around that area, because there's 4 or 5 people in that area that haven't been tested yet, then they'll pop up a little bit more positive where you haven't tested over in this area, which didn't have anything going on, and they're still gonna come up negative. And then when you go into enforcement, is it that we're gonna look at, okay, seems to be a hot spot, so we're gonna go over here and we're gonna start writing citations in that area to try and clean up that one particular area. And then it's like, okay, well, we've got the municipality taken care of, and then we've got the public education, the schools and that thing taken care of, and then it kind of trickles out into whatever other industries or other businesses that might be in that area that keep going, and so that's how it's actually gonna like go into effect?
When the rules roll out, all of those 600 supplies would have to test within the first 3 months because they haven't had a data point yet.
Okay.
So that's the way that the ramp up is gonna be conducted, is those systems that had over half the MCL or were not tested would go in the first 3 months. Then basically everybody else would be covered under the first 6 months. And so what we're suggesting here is we believe that we have a very statistically sound population here. So the percentages are gonna probably fall out pretty much the same way that we've seen before. If a system in that initial round of testing has a positive result, they go to quarterly testing, or if they have an MCL exceedance, then we follow the process that's laid out in the rules.
And then that goes to your point where if somebody wants to go to like an administrative, they have to go through that and they can start negotiating to kind of work with the system.
That's where it kind of goes to, there are the routine enforcement activities that are very clearly defined in the rule. If you fail to monitor, there's a routine violation that would be issued. If you're over the MCL, the public would be notified of that, you'd be issued a maximum contaminant level violation. But to rectify the maximum contaminant level violation, to treat the water, provide safe water, that's where you enter into the process of working out a more flexible approach for resupply. How would you move forward to correct the MCL? And there's different paths to do that. But there's always going to be routine enforcement taken against any supply that has an exceedance or fails to monitor because the public is made aware of that. It's just how you move forward to correct that. There's some flexibility built into the process.
So can I also make a suggestion that you might talk about some of the ones that were below 70 but had elevated levels and some of the things they've done on their own, other than using granular activated carbon as a treatment system to, or considering?
I can speak
Go
to
ahead.
a couple specific examples. We did have a school that chose to place a new well. Their new well is testing below the potential MCL, whereas their original well was testing above it. So they've worked out a different approach to coming into what, we're talking about theoretical compliance at this point. They voluntarily took an action to bring their levels down. Another school installed just recently, I believe, received a permit to install an ion exchange resin system, which is a little different than an activated carbon system, similar but different. Those are the two very specific examples that I can think of as far as long-term solutions. Were you thinking of any more specific?
I was thinking that there was also consideration of hooking one of the ballparks up to an existing municipal supply.
Yes, we do have I believe it is a child care facility that is planning to hook into the local municipality. It was advantageous location-wise, and they were able to, or are becoming able to make that happen in the future.
So once they know that they're out of compliance and they get a citation, then the form of public opinion kicks in immediately, that the public is notified, or there's
notified of the exceedance of a maximum contaminant level within 30 days. Yes. And then the path forward to correct that. There's various paths forward.
So in these three cases that you spoke of, all the areas were notified?
Well, there's no rule in place right now.
There was no rule yet, so that's why the notification process didn't happen, and they were able to
Probably did.
rectify it.
Well, they were told.
It probably
Oh, it
did.
did.
Just not under the rule requirements.
Yeah, I'm
Okay.
sure the schools, sure they. That was my nightmare
Because I
for
watched
the
what
school.
happened with the lead in the water, and the schools like across the country, they all, like several big municipalities had lead in their water. I didn't see a lot of discussion about all those, although Flint kept coming up to the forefront. But there are other municipalities, and so that, like in other states, and so that's why I was just curious as to how that form of public opinion goes forward.
All right. Yeah, Dave?
Yeah, I wanted to just go back to the kind of follow on what Eric said about the 5 criteria that we have up on the board. Seems to me we need to look at what we're doing here in light of those. And just to kind of restate, basically what he said, just to restate again, I think 4A, the rules are draft report, that's been certified. If the rules don't exceed the rulemaking delegation. I think 4B appears that it has been satisfied with the rulemaking one. I'm going to skip C for a minute. I think 4D is clear and unambiguous. We're going to have a public hearing, or there's going to be at some point in this process a public hearing. And these are draft rules, so there's some specific language that can be cleaned up and addressed. Hopefully that will maybe come out of what we've already heard here today. The draft proposed rules are based on sound and objective scientific reasoning. We did participate in the meeting with MPART and heard from the scientific advisory group. And they looked at all the studies, we participated in that. They set the numbers. We may not agree with the numbers, but it's hard for me to say that it wasn't based on sound and objective scientific reasoning. I don't think they just picked the number out of the air and do it. So I believe that. And I know I'm a scientist, and Mother Nature is always, you never quite know what you're dealing with. So there's some ambiguity to Grant's point on the numbers, 14 versus 12 or vice versa. But at the same time, I hear what Eric is saying, that you got to have a number to do it. So I think 40. Going back to item C, I think the rules appear to me to be necessary and suitable. I think the question that I'm hearing from people around the table, as well as from the comments from the public, that there's a concern that we don't fully understand the burden that they place on individual businesses. I was very pleased to hear that the stakeholders that talked to us indicated that Eagle was receptive to the comments in the listening sessions. I think that's great. That was very, very good to hear that. I think that's one of the reasons we're here as a committee, is to ensure that takes place. We did hear comments. We need to make sure we look at everything, that they need to look at everything, that we need to be aware of the cost. There's issues about the funding concerns. It all seems to come down to the burden that it would potentially place on individual businesses. It seems to me, as we go through this, the regulatory impact statement is where we can address that. There's been concerns that Rob's raised about some of the cost numbers that are in there. So I would like to make a motion that we delay this process until November 21st meeting, and request that Eagle go back and revise the regulatory impact statement to address some of the concerns that have been brought up today.
Second.
Okay. Any further discussion, I guess, on that motion that's on the table? Okay.
Well,
Sure, go ahead.
I'm curious if someone can answer, because I know you raised the question about the 15 million. It sounds like they left Ann Arbor out. And I'm interested in the schools who initiated their own solutions. And so by choice, was this a choice that the city of Plainfield went for? Can anybody on the staff speak to that 15 million to try to address some of that? I just think the whole issue of, I think we should move forward, so I said it.
Okay.
No, Helen, I think you're posing an important question. I'm kind of like still at the cost level. Granulated activated carbon, or whatever the mean by which you address it, because this is more going around the issue and tapping into well, we solve that problem, but eventually it might catch up with you where a particular public supply that cannot have that option, and you got to go through granulated activated carbon. The question is more to the waste management industry: is will they be able to take that granulated activated carbon? I remember Steve Sliver put that the life cycle of PFAS, right? And so it goes to the landfill. You've got the leaches. Leaches goes into the. So you're just moving it from one place to another, and then goes into the river, and then from the river back up into plants uptake or residential uptake and all that. And the question is, are we taking all that cost? Because it goes beyond just the granulated activated carbon, but is the waste management industry going to be able to take it? Or they're going to say, no, go to thermal destruction. And if you go to thermal destruction, would they take it? Because they may not have permits that would allow them, because they cannot forecast what the breakdown of the compounds would look like. So from an air permitting standpoint, it may be problematic. So
And
I'm concerned with that and the cost associated with that is not right now reflected in the RAS. It may not change the rules, but.
I mean, I have not done this before, but I have a question. So I've learned from your comments. I would share that concern. However, to me, the driver is drinking water quality for people and getting that right. There's a bunch of things. Disposal, communities that won't be able to afford this. What will happen with the school that are definitely important issues to address, but this committee is not going to solve those. So I believe our job is to, and I like the fact that James was saying that these are draft and it's time to get the public's comments, and I think we would hear a lot about those industries and learn a lot from that process that could amend it. But I think we're only kicking the can down the road for a few weeks, and we're not gonna answer those. And I think that we could request that these costs be better explored, but the reality is we're shooting for drinking water quality, I believe. And that's why those things are not gonna be solved in a night. So I think that's.
To answer your question, the hazardous waste industry is taking the activated carbon. They're not refusing it. They do have ways to dispose of it. It is limiting that public exposure at this point is what we're shooting for. Unclear how the costs are being associated to this proposal, but
So
they do take it.
I think getting at moving forward in order to fully address those issues, those are real concerns all of you are raising that we need to address, but we're not gonna solve that by a 3-week delay in a revised document. I think we have to allow the process to go forward to dig into it.
Jeremy?
Yeah, and just following up on that, like I agree, right? I don't think much is gonna change in 3 weeks, and more than that, I think we're proposing political questions that aren't within the scope of this rule review committee on a number of those issues as well that, again, still wouldn't be answered in the 21 days delay. The longer we delay, the longer we continue to expose impacted communities to poison water, plain and simple, right? Especially most impacted communities, which are pregnant women and infants, right? And as we've heard from the gentleman from Scotia, right, that's dealing with it right now, and we've also heard from the representative, I think Ms. Richards from MML, right? There's a way we can move forward with a sense of urgency and still answer all of the questions that we have. And the way to do that is through the public comment period. The longer we delay it, the longer we delay the opportunity to actually have these questions answered on record and responded to in a meaningful way. So for me, it's from a legal standpoint, is this stuff met? To me, answer is yes, like clear and convincing. So therefore, I'm of the opinion we move forward with public comment, have our questions addressed there on record.
Any further comment on the motion? So we've got a motion on the table from Dave to essentially delay the vote until November 21st, I guess.
And requesting a revised regulatory
And
based on the
revised.
comments they've heard today. And we have to specify the reason, I think, why we're requesting a delay and give them something in writing requesting that, I believe is my understanding.
So I think that's a proper motion. Essentially, our option is voting by majority vote that additional review is needed to determine whether the draft proposed rules meet the criteria in subsection 4 and to request a regulatory.
And this is, I think, more of a legal question for, I know you mentioned the AG is here. Does this delay automatically default to whatever the delay would have been were we voting on it? So, 30 days, 90 days, legally, right? Can we just say, let's delay 21 days without that default being much longer? Yeah.
I thought about that today, this morning as well. I don't know if you're still here, but my view is that we would still be able to vote at November 21st to be effective at the time. So it's not that you have to take 90 days. I think the statute, anyone can feel free to disagree with me. I think the statute says that if we don't do anything, if we take more than 90 days and we haven't gotten further extension, they could go ahead and move it to a public hearing, but there's nothing preventing us from, voting in 21 days to move it at that point. So I don't think it's if I understood your question correctly.
so not take the full 90 days.
Right, I don't think you're required to. Yeah, you're not required,
No,
but
you're
we're not required to
Yeah.
take the full.
That's why.
You're now our lawyer, Ron.
Well, that's
I'm
our
here in my
interview.
individual capacity, not as counsel to the,
I guess my observation would be, I think the intent is, my intent earlier was to say, it's Fisher cut bait on the 21st. And if that was your intent,
Yes.
then we can make it clear.
I think there's been issues raised about the RIS, and I just asked them to revise that.
No,
So then the idea is it would be an extension to November 21st. Is that consistent with your intent in the second?
Yeah, to make sure we're in compliance with D up there.
right.
Yeah.
Right.
We need
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, this is,
We would
this
need an
is
extension.
By taking action today, we are in compliance with the.
Correct.
And the 35 days expires when?
I believe it's.
It was October 11th, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So it'll be
Yeah,
November
15th, I think, 15th, 16th,
Yeah.
something like that.
It's like the 16th or something like that. So
Right.
the 30, if you look at it that standpoint, we got a 6-day extension off of the 35.
Right.
If you go to the 21st.
What's the drop dead date?
November 21st.
Oh, our exact meeting day is the drop dead date.
Well, per his motion, I mean, we could extend it longer in the statute if we wanted.
We could vote again then to extend it
We
if
could.
that was the wish of the group, but I think from a procedural standpoint, and since neither Rob or I are acting lawyers of the group, this is non-viable legal advice, right? Because we get, what is it? You get, what do you get for free advice? Pro bono.
May I propose something? And probably it's too soon to say that, but would it make sense if it is possible to schedule and still be within how much public notice we need to give and make it more within the 35 days and do it November 15, providing that Eagle will be able to revise the RIS?
We have to give notice of our meeting, right?
Yes, you have.
Yeah,
We're asking
for an
to move
open
the
meeting
to
day.
the 16th.
Yeah.
What-
And still be within 35, so you're not delaying anything prior.
In other words, if we're still.
As long as everybody's scheduled.
Well, I think a couple challenges, yeah, I think, well, to the broader point, I know there were a couple people that couldn't make it on the 21st, so we should make sure that if we extend to the 21st, that we already have quorums, I think. Helen and Fadi, maybe you are gone on the 21st.
Oh, you're gone on the 21st.
But we can still proceed without them, but I unless we're missing two other people that we couldn't proceed.
We have to have
So let's
9
make sure that
quorums.
even the 21st we work on our, conceivably. So is anyone else not able to make the 21st?
That was not why I was saying go forward, just by
You're not gonna do it?
I can't be here. No, I'm in Illinois.
Does anyone else have a conflict with the 21st? Okay, if not, then I think the 21st would still work. I hear your point. I guess has the advantage of getting it done 5 days earlier, and we wouldn't actually have to vote on anything today, I suppose, is the other benefit of that. But I don't know if the 15th or 16th would work for people.
16th is a Saturday, so we'd actually technically be doing the 15th.
Yeah.
We typically
Well,
meet on the 14th.
It's 35 calendar days.
Yeah, 35 calendar
We're
days.
acting as,
Yeah, it would be,
quasi-contract.
it's November 15th, I think, is our deadline.
I think that 14th might work better. If you're gonna move it ahead, just to give it, we are in the state of Michigan. There's a lot of people that.
Have other plans on the 15th?
Yes.
That might make traffic to Lansing less problematic.
Probably would, but there's a lot of people here that may be angry at that, so.
Yeah, I understood.
Especially on a Friday.
Yeah, I didn't realize it was a Friday.
In deference to Claudia and Helen, the 15th, 14th makes.
14th is fine with me.
Is gives an accommodation to them, I'm fine with that.
If they think that they can do what we ask on revising the RIS.
I think
So let me-
it'll take more time to run it through channels than it will to draft it.
Well, it's 21st, 14th, what difference does it make really if everybody can make
I
it?
mean, I can make it work, I still don't think it's necessary, to be honest. I just think,
Understood.
yeah.
but we would need the specific questions.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, could we get, I mean, I think the committee, could we commit to getting you the questions this week?
Notes from the discussion and so forth, we route, anybody has questions, route them through you and you route them. You wanna do that way?
Yeah, or send me your specific questions. I think that might be best. We get them to you tomorrow and that would give you a week, you know, you get back to us in a week.
What are the questions that, I think the summary of the questions, I mean, is it, what is the 15 versus the 7.4, or is it the impact on 201, or what was?
I think those were the two primary questions, I guess, but if I missed it.
It's mainly related to exposure.
Or disposal.
I had an RIS question that I wanted to.
Okay, so I think if we gather those, no, just talking hypothetically here, gather those tomorrow, emails to me or to the group, probably best to just email them to the group, and then Dave could get them onto the right individuals. Yeah.
Well, no.
Yeah, sure.
I'm okay. I just wanted to comment on, obviously, you know, this is a serious rule topic we're looking at. We intended to have this to talk about at the last meeting and then to be voting at this meeting. So the fact that that didn't go that way, and if we do end up, you know, extending it, I don't think it's to show that we're not in support of moving it forward. It's kind of, this is the process that it was, you know, ideally we would have had things, we would have had a month to have a meeting to talk and then to move forward. So as a first time sitting at this table also, it feels a lot of pressure to be voting on it as it's presented the first time and not having some period after the discussion and after to hearing more comments. That's just my comment, I guess.
I've been informed that we can get further answers to some of those questions if you'd like to hear more. Karen Keeley is willing to answer some of the questions that have been raised, is available if the committee desires kind of further explanation of that.
Can we, let's pause on that. So there's a motion on the table to extend to the 21st. Just procedurally, let me first of all confirm, does anyone have an objection to meeting on November 14th? Is anyone not available?
We have a notice problem if we meet on the 14th, because we've noticed the 21st.
It's a special
You
meeting.
could notice a special meeting. You have enough time
18
to
hours.
notice a special meeting.
Oh, this, because it's a icy, very good.
Jeremy?
Yeah, I have another.
Now you're all right.
Oh, okay.
From Saturday before, so I probably would make the
14th is better. Okay.
14th.
So 21st we would, well, we might just barely be okay, but pushing it, right? So, yeah, we would want, I guess the 14th, we'd get the full participation too.
Just on the 14th.
Alan, does
Oh,
14
sorry.
work for you?
Yeah, I can make it work. It's
On the
in
14th?
afternoon. Yeah.
Dave?
And then just a question, we've heard some of the comments concerning the RIS about the cost. There's the $15 million number in there, there's $7.5 million. There was various questions being raised about that. I think Eric had a question about it, and then Fadi and Mark had questions about some of the impact on the disposal pieces of it. There were questions that were brought up and they weren't really answered. If we get you the list of questions based on what you heard today, not that someone's gonna cook up a new question between now and tomorrow, but based on the questions you heard today, and we got those to you tomorrow, would we be able to get a revised IRS within that window if we tried to do the meeting on the 14th?
I would say either answers to your questions
Answers
or
to the
revised
questions.
RIS, we could get you some further information.
Okay.
Well, in that case, then, I would withdraw my motion to delay this until November 21st, and with the idea that within the November 14th, we'll be within our 35-day window that we were originally set for.
Right. I guess we probably don't have to call a special meeting. I don't know if that.
Why would you
requires a
officially
vote.
adopt a special
Yeah, I think we just
meeting?
vote on it.
Okay,
too.
so the chair can call a special meeting, and to call the chair, you don't need a motion to do that?
Well, that was
That's
my
my
question.
point.
I'm not sure. I mean,
We don't need a
Not
motion to
bylaws per
table,
se, so.
since it's in the agenda, to table the vote.
Roberts should tell you to do that.
Don't we have to table the vote?
That's
Because
probably a
that's
good
where
idea.
we're at on the agenda.
Yeah, so let's do that. Let's, if someone would make a motion to
Move
table the
table
vote.
to,
Call special.
do I have to give the date? Move
I
the
think
table
so.
to the next scheduled meeting at the call of the chair.
That's fine, as long as I have the ability to call a special meeting. I don't call offhand. Or we just vote on the 14th being the special meeting. Then we don't have a question.
Why doesn't the mover modify his motion?
Great idea.
To reschedule, to meet on the 14th of November.
I can do that, that's fine. Modify the motion that I made to meet on, but not request a delay. We don't need
And
to
then the
request a delay.
second supports the modification of the mover's motion.
You're tabling the vote to the
No,
14th.
Oh. Okay, so that's a dual motion.
See, that's the problem. We have to table the vote. It's in
You
the
have to
agenda.
table-
that
you have
we're
to
voting.
table, you're right,
Right,
he's absolutely
right,
right.
right.
Got to table it first. All right, I will move to table to the next scheduled meeting.
Second. Daniel, all right. All in favor of tabling to the next meeting? Aye. All those opposed?
Your motion's on.
I don't think you need it.
You're seconding his
I
motion.
don't think you need
I don't
it.
think we need it, because we're gonna have
Well, let's,
Well,
I think you
we
want-
did
want to
request a revision to the, regulatory impact statement. And I don't need, that has to be, that doesn't have to be pushed now.
no, should we vote on it?
Go ahead.
To set a special meeting?
Move to set a special.
I think that's a good idea.
To set a special meeting.
On the 14th.
Okay, so originally, you want me to do it? You second?
I can, I'm not.
I move to schedule a special meeting on November 14th to review the supplemental comments on the regulatory impact statement.
Second.
All in favor of setting a special meeting on November 14th, say aye.
Aye.
Okay.
Aye. Wish we'd had a second to comment. Do we
Okay.
need to say we're gonna vote?
That's a deadline, we gotta vote or extend it.
I think we'll have the possibility to do something, right? So we'll have the flexibility.
That was the point of moving it to 14th, I think, was it's not technically an extension. It's taking us to the end of the time period, and at that point, we are statutorily obligated to act or extend.
Fail to act.
Right.
Our chair will put that in the agenda.
That's right.
Failure to act constitutes, the failure to act rules of first meeting.
So, did we, I don't know if we voted on the special meeting. All in favor of the special meeting on November 14th, say aye. Aye. Opposed? Okay. 1 o'clock. Okay, so getting back to the agenda, we've tabled the vote on the draft rules. We have some additional housekeeping. We're all getting state email addresses, so
Yes, I have all the information.
Kendra, I'll turn it over to you to just get us up to speed on this.
So for the governor's executive directive, we are to conduct all state business with state email addresses. So we've created like email accounts for all of the board members. So I have your password, username, and email address, and I'll hand out and also instructions on how to access it. So any business that's conducted should be handled through these email addresses. Until we can get a rule set up saying that you have an email, we'll just send an email to your personal account and say, hey, you have an email in your state account, take a look at it, and then you guys can respond to that state account.
Great. And then is there a?
So let me understand that, I get an email and I respond back to that email, whatever that email tells me to do, and then I've got a state email address?
No, so you have a state email address where all business will be conducted in that. So, and just to make it easier for you, so you don't have to check it multiple times a week or whatever, I'll just send an email to your personal email saying, hey, check your state account for email.
Gotcha, thank you.
One other question, there's a committee, a public committee email where they can send us feedback, or is?
They basically send one to everybody? A
Well,
group email?
If someone from the public wants to send a comment to the committee, how do they do that? Like, I don't know if our emails will be public, but is there an errc@michigan.gov where they can send?
Well, that's something I think we should talk about. I mean, we did not create a mailbox yet for the committee. I think that's something you may want to discuss if you want to be encouraging a lot of written comments, or do you want the comments to come during the normal, formal public comment, public hearing process of the rulemaking process?
Well, that's interesting. So there's 3 avenues for input. One, direct to the committee. The other,
You show up like today, you.
Second, public comment during meetings of the committee. And the third is, once the rules are set out, that comment be directed through that rule process.
Right, yeah.
Correct.
You should make that clear so that.
Well, yeah, and I think if we try to encourage a lot of written comments to the committee, some people are going to assume that those comments would be passed along into the formal comment period during the rulemaking process, and that gets very confusing for people. So my recommendation is that we don't create this mailbox, but still, you know, the public will know that during the formal rulemaking process, you know, we have to provide public notice through newspapers and let people know there is a public comment period and hearing, so they can either submit written comments or appear at the hearing and give verbal testimony or do both. But I think that's where we want to direct those comments.
I totally agree. I would
Maybe
draw.
we should have David write up sort of a little outline of instructions, if you will, that we can take a look at the next meeting. And then consider whether that gets posted or
Okay.
somehow distributed.
Yeah, I
so
can.
People know clearly where to go with
Right.
those comments. And then when we have state email addresses, those are discoverable by the public generally, right? So there's no reason people can't send direct comments if they want to.
Right.
But we want to make it clear that to be formally included in the review process, they need to go where you're going to tell them to go.
Right. Yeah, I'll write something up that explains that.
CC James Good.
So, good point. I know, James, you mentioned Aaron's here to help answer.
I didn't know
Well,
if
we've
you
got
wanted- He had a little bit more detail if you wanted it.
Yeah, I think that would be, might as well. We've got him here. We're all here. Yeah, any additional input you can provide would be helpful. Sorry, we're just blowing this thing out of the water.
I thought you were ready to walk out the door, guy. Aaron Keatley, Chief Deputy Director at Eagle. I was part of the team that worked with the different stakeholder groups as the program worked on its regs. So I think I know most of your questions, actually, the answers to them. We'd be happy to respond to anything you may want to send our way in writing, irrespective. But see if I can remember them all as we go around the table. But in terms of your question, Bobby, in terms of the expense on disposal, if you remember, George had that slide that showed upfront costs and then operational ongoing costs. That operational ongoing costs included, based on the flow of the water at the system, how often that material would have to be changed out, and then the disposal costs associated with it as of today, recognizing disposal costs can change over time, but that was included in that estimate. So that is already incorporated into the impact statement. In terms of the 201 criteria and which standards would go into place immediately, the way the 201 statute is worded, and of course that's a statutory mandate on us, it's not something that Eagle has any ability to change. That would have to be a regulatory change if anybody wanted to make an alteration to it. The way it's laid out is where there's an existing criteria, and currently there's an existing criteria for PFOA and PFOS. Those would go into effect immediately upon passage of an MCL rule. For the other constituents that do not currently have a criteria established for them, we would have to go through a formal rulemaking process if we wanted to go forward with those. So only 2 of the constituents would go into effect immediately. Tell me if I'm wrong.
We'll need to get clarification on that one for you in the written form.
Yeah, just in case I'm wrong.
Might we get some further clarification on that one in the written form?
In terms of the cost, Rob, you were asking about that. The way that we're obligated underneath the regulatory impact analysis, we have to associate the cost of the rule to the cost of implementation. So any activities that were already done voluntarily outside of the rule, for example, you used the case over in Kent County, that could not be included by us because the rule isn't driving that cost. That cost has already been incurred. So that's why it's excluded. We'd be happy to narrate that in the document or in writing for you if it helps. But so all existing investments, the changing of the well, things Ian was identified to you and stuff, those are existing costs that Michigan has already borne. And, but we were trying to identify the costs associated with the rules themselves.
Yeah, and my question was just a little different, which was, how could the 7 point, so you got 22, you know, we're talking in generalities, but 22 different situations, sources that we're expecting are gonna have to, you know, do some compliance technology in place. We're estimating 7.4 million for all of those. But right here, we've got Plainfield, and it costs them 15 million just alone, so how could that 7.4 be accurate? That was my question.
And the New Jersey effort that George referenced in terms of how we use as a basis, that was primarily based on flow and concentration. So based on what we know of the existing systems, the size of those systems, that helps us determine what the sizing of that GAC unit needs to be at the facility. So some facilities that are very small will have a very low upfront cost because they have less of an infrastructure they have to establish. Some that would be larger, like you are identifying, which of course wasn't included in our regulatory impact analysis, that would be much higher because of the increased flow and the increased concentration that's at that facility.
So your statements are consistent?
Yeah. Yeah. And so to your basic question, is that 7.4, 7 something, is that cumulative? Yes, it is.
Yeah.
But it's not equally spread across each of them. It's based on size, flow, concentration.
What that's telling us is those 22 are a lot smaller than Plainfield.
Oh, absolutely.
Combined.
Okay.
If you look at the list, the majority of
That's
them
what
are
it's telling
very
me.
small systems. My guess is there's going to be many of those systems that will just choose not to be in the business of drinking water anymore. If they can connect into a more reliable public water supply and not make that investment, because one of the things I'm going to be concerned about is small systems that don't have the financial capacity long-term to maintain and operate complex systems. You know, they're used to a very simple well system, and now all of a sudden they're treating for a more complex situation. Anything we can do to facilitate them not having to do that so that we can ensure that we get long quality, you know, high quality water over a long period of time is in the state's best interest. But all our estimates were still on everybody putting in GAC because again, that was the treatment technology that was selected as the primary one for the purposes of the rule.
On the 201 side, have you contemplated, see, I don't have enough experience with the regulatory impact statement process to know whether there's a place in drinking water rule impact statement to also reflect the other secondary impacts from the rule, like the 201. Was that discussed? Was that considered? Is that not normally done?
It was discussed. We decided not to put it in there intentionally. We did want to make a reference to it so that it wasn't, didn't give the appearance that we were ignoring the reality that there may be other costs associated with other aspects of the rulemaking. But again, this is a statutory mandate. We don't have control over that. So ultimately, the fiscal impact associated with 201 applicability is really a statutory fiscal impact, not this rule. So we could definitely discuss that and narrate it a little bit, but ultimately, if this body felt it wasn't appropriate for those MCLs to be part of the 201 criteria, the ask would have to go back to the legislative body, not to EGLE, because we don't have the authority to make that change.
Right. But in the event that other PFAS were added to the 201 criteria, then it would fall under a regulatory impact statement under the 201 criteria.
If we did rules under 201 for other PFAS constituents, then absolutely we would have to spell those out.
That's very helpful.
Thank you. Sure.
And then, so the 5 remaining MCLs that will require rulemaking, do those rules then come back before ERRC?
Absolutely. Any rule would come back before your body.
Okay. Any other questions for Aaron? Okay. Thank you. All right, so we're good on the email addresses. I think we can vote to adjourn. Motion to adjourn? Second. All in favor of adjourning? Aye. Opposed? Okay. Thanks, everybody. Kinder, are you gonna